Godflesh were and still are an incredible band. I love them because they were sort of heavy and weird and not really metal band, just way too weird and angular to be metal, but still very heavy and aggressive. The first time I saw them, they had these like tiny little amps that they would put up. Their amps were so small they had to put them on chairs to project the sound. There was like these amps were like cornflake boxes, and I was like, what is this? And then they just hit play on this drum machine and started playing. It's like the biggest cavernous, ridiculous sound you've ever heard in your life from two guys playing amps the size of cornflake boxes. Just absolutely brilliant. This song in particular was definitely a big influence, and if you care to listen to Spanish Fly from Hate Songs in E minor, you might possibly notice a few similarities.
You just heard Spanish Fly from Fudge Tunnel's Hate Songs in E minor from 1991. This is the Rec Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And we also heard from another person there, Mark. That's kind of interesting.
Oh.
Yeah, Alex Newport. We'll tell you a little bit about that. Him talking a bit about Avalanche Master song from Godflesh and how that was an influence on the song that we kind of opened up with. So
heir to the cigarette fortune.
What's that? Yes.
Newports.
Yeah, Newports. Which are, the menthol. Aren't those the menthol ones that they're going to start to take out of circulation?
Because black people like them, they're taking them out of circulation.
There you go. So, but yeah, so R.I.P. Newports for the few lovers out there. But yeah, for people kind of just joining Requiem Metal Podcast, we this a kind of heavy duty metal podcast. Maybe you discovered us through Dead Kennedys or Misfits or Typo Negative or some of our more mainstream episodes that we've been doing the last several months. And we like to float around and look at kind of different genres within the sort of heavy spectrum. We'll kind of talk about whether or not Fudge Tunnel even would quote unquote fall into this, sort of the metal category. And that would be a topic that will come up from time to time throughout the episode. But Mark is a illustrator, does a lot of comic books independently and does work with Decibel. And what are some of the other sort of avenues that you've kind of got going creatively?
I do books about metal bands. I do t-shirts and what the hell else have I done lately? I've just been working on a book that I can't really talk about yet, but
cool.
Pretty heavy into that. But yeah, it's going to be a good one. We'll definitely have some podcast material.
Yeah, I think so.
After this. Maybe a 14-hour one, but who knows?
Yeah, no shit. But so if you're interested in any Requiem swag, you can go to actually requiemmetal.com and click on the link for t-shirts and things like that. But I'm a school teacher, mild-mannered school teacher by day, and then kind of heavy metal impresario podcast person by night, researcher, historian, whatever you want to call it. But Mark and I are both like deep dive kind of nerds. We're both hardcore film people. I teach a film class and a music history class. And so if you're just joining us or just kind of discovering us recently and you didn't know what the hell our backstory was, that's kind of what we've been doing. And
so artist and teacher talk about metal, not necessarily just metal, but any kind
heavy
of music.
Yeah. Music we like,
music has a story that relates to heavy metal in some capacity.
Yeah. We've done everything from, Stooges and, Peter Green and Fleetwood Mac. And, we've run the gamut a little bit. So
the
for
Allman
sure.
Brothers.
Yeah. One of my favorites, doing that episode with our old record store manager. That's kind of how Mark and I really sort of solidified our friendship. We knew each other through Requiem magazine, through Decibel's. Chris Dick was a mutual friend that sort of linked he and I together, and we started hanging out at some Milwaukee Metal Fest. I think that was the first time we met. And then the three of us kind of started working both at the record store and on another magazine called Eclipse. And here we are. And we've been here since 2008. So fucking crazy.
It's quite a career. And Requiem magazine that this is the namesake of, started out in, I think, 1992.
Yeah, you and Chris, and we all kind of grew up in the same sort of northern Michigan small town. And, who knew that two big, large underground, international extreme metal magazines would come out of like Central Michigan. But hey, weirder things have happened. So, but yeah, well, you just kind of heard there, Spanish Fly. This one of the kind of trademark kind of sounds of Fudge Tunnel. You have kind of that sort of grinding, sludgy kind of energy mixed with kind of even Alex kind of talked about the propulsive sort of post-apocalyptic kind of industrial churn that you sort of associate with a band like Godflesh, perhaps, and some others that we'll talk about. I love that main riff pattern. It sort of sounds like, and I feel like this is like a kindred spirit with Alex. It's like if Kim Thale and Paige Hamilton from Helmet were kind of like grooving out together almost, Yeah,
there's also the Helmet thing of the drop D tuning.
Yeah,
it's a real. That was just kind of a huge. Even like Triptykon and Celtic Frost were mostly. I don't know if all of Celtic Frost was drop D, but definitely Triptykon's all drop D, like drop D Marshall tone that has some breadth within the notes. It's like there's a lot of similarities there, and as far as the sound's concerned.
It's funny, speaking of, Triptykon, Celtic Frost, I had a student who's a pretty avid listener of our podcast, so he'll be hearing this out and kind of the shout out. And he'll come in my room sometimes after school, and we'll sort of like kind of chat about stuff and kind of go down some, different weird avenues and things. And he was like, I hear you guys talk about Celtic Frost all the time, but what's the big deal on them? And he's young. He's just kind of curious, and he's not trying to be rude with that. He's just trying to like piece all the context together. And I was like, well, let me just play you this song. And I played him Dethrone Emperor. And I was like, this riff here, this is their riff. And like, he heard it, he goes, that riff's in everything. I said, that's why we talk about Celtic Frost in every episode. I said, this is like the big bang right here of it. Like this, Bathory, Venom, a few others. And he's like, oh, okay. I said, yeah, you should check out our old episode. And, so he's probably interested. I didn't really get into the weird stuff with Frost, but I figure he can kind of discover that on his own. So,
and then you go back into Hellhammer and discover all the
exactly.
proto stuff.
Then we went into Voivod because he's like, I've always heard of Voivod. What's the deal with them? And so played him some Voivod, and he was getting into that. So it's a fun conversation to be able to have after school. But
absolutely.
The other thing that's really interesting in Spanish Fly that I think is kind of cool is you get this like that high pitched kind of frenzied intensity of that. I'll call it a lead guitar, but Alex doesn't really play leads per se, but it's definitely
that. It does on one song we're going to hear later on. But
really?
That's about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's only one I've noticed.
You'll have to point that out because I don't think I made a note of that. But that riff is fucking stunning. And it to me, it has that piercing, overdriven quality that you hear like early on with like your MC5 and the Stooges and Sonic's Rendezvous. But I also think like it took me a while, and it was driving me crazy what it reminded me of. And I was like, oh, it sounds like Slint, Nosferatu, man.
Yeah.
That wee, that like kind of almost out of tune, almost like if they went like a little further with it, it might be like kind of like nails on a chalkboard, but it kind of works in this discordant kind of beautiful way, I
think he's like bending the note at the end too, so it has this like unnatural kind of decay to it.
Yeah, for sure. And it's something on a more mainstream level. And this is something I'm going to bring up later in the episode, but I'm going to plant the seed now. I think it's something like, if you wanted to say like, okay, Fudge Tunnel, we're going to be talking about throughout the episode. They sometimes got tagged as like, oh, this is like the British answer to grunge or whatever. And whatever, we'll unpack that later. Take it for what it is. But I really think like their kindred spirit in the States was like early Smashing Pumpkins.
I think so too. I think Smashing Pumpkins, especially in the in some of those types of riffs that we just heard. And it's like, Pitch Shifter, Godflesh, a lot of like these death industrial bands would do that kind of, it'd be like a good counterpoint to that really just kind of heavy Melvins riffs they're throwing in there too.
Yeah.
Melvins were drop D for, some of their career too.
Yep, I agree. And I think, if you just kind of took like 1/3 Melvins, like 1/3 Smashing Pumpkins, and then 1/3 just weird, whether it's industrial or Jesus Lizard, noise rock, Big Black, and you threw those kind of into a pot, you sort of have some of the basic ingredients of Fudge Tunnel,
Yeah, I think especially in the drumming, it's very like Jimmy Chamberlain-ish from Smashing Pumpkins on the, just how he's playing that kit.
Yeah, and lots of also Dale Crover. The way he just beats the fuck out of the kit.
Yeah.
And And the way that Dale always played, that's the thing, like, that I always kind of dug. And I know, people have their own mixed feelings on Dave Grohl, but Dave Grohl took a lot of his cues from like a guy like Crover. And whether you like Grohl as a human or as a guitar player, a songwriter, regardless, but you listen to him play on like Nevermind and stuff like that, and he's beating the fuck out of the kit the way Crover did, and so like that's something I've always admired about like the way, like, the kind of caveman approach,
Well, even on that Queens of Stone Age record that he songs for the deaf,
just fucking killing it on that record. He, Grohl's like interesting. He kind of sometimes reminds me of like the way Prince sometimes would be. Like, Prince didn't show you all the time that he was like the best fucking guitar player in the world, but on occasion he would just like lay in a riff and you'd be like, holy fuck, that sounds like Eddie Hazel from Funkadelic or Carlos Santana, or and he like, but then he would just be like, oh no, I'm just gonna do like this pop song where I'm just playing like funk, like synth beats the whole time. You don't get to hear my guitar. And I feel like Grohl does that. He's like, no, I'm just gonna do this like catchy fucking song by numbers, Foo Fighters song, and then on occasion he'll be like, oh yeah, I can also beat the shit out of the kit when I need to.
Yeah,
so kind of interesting. But yeah, this is not a Foo Fighters episode, Mark. We're here to talk about Fudge Tunnel. So kind of a little backstory, and Fudge Tunnel hail from Nottingham, and they've been around. Basically, they were around from '88 to '95, and
home of Earache Records.
Yeah, yep, home of Earache Records. In their early years, we'll talk about their first couple releases. They came out on Pig Boy, but then by the time they put out a full length, they're on Earache. And it's a trio, power trio, and that's going to kind of come up throughout a bit. They even throw some odes to it. Actually, we'll be ending part 2 with their ode to the ultimate kind of power trio band. But yeah, you heard obviously Alex Newport there on vocals and guitar, and then he's alongside Adrian Parkin on drums. And we're actually going to be hearing from Adrian throughout the episode too. So he'll be kind of dropped in at various times, get a chance to sort of speak with him, which is pretty cool. We did reach out to Alex, but he was pretty busy. I think he's setting up a new production studio in Joshua Tree, is what Nick Green was kind of telling me.
Oh, nice.
And Nick kind of got to know the guys pretty well because he interviewed them for a Decibel Hall of Fame for Hate Songs. And so we'll be hearing from that Hate Songs interview. We'll kind of read some excerpts from it throughout the episode, and then I believe in part 2, we're going to be hearing from our good friend Nick Green. So that's pretty cool.
We will.
So yeah, we got lots of special guests kind of floating all over the place with this episode. It started off as just a normal Fudge Tunnel episode, and then it sort of just grew into this like Frankenstein monster. So
this is one of those bands too where I've always enjoyed them, but we never really discussed doing a show. But it's like, why not? Like I've been into this band since Hate Songs. Because it was kind of like there's like some periphery, like, skateboarder friends that were into, Jesus Lizard and this other shit that I didn't really know much about. And I was like, hey, have you guys heard this? Like, what a dumb name. And when they heard it, I was like, oh, this sounds fucking awesome.
I was just going to ask you, like, what are your first memories of Fudge Tunnel before we kind of get into their history and stuff like that?
I don't know if I heard it on like some kind of sampler first, but I remember hearing it and right away, like we were always trying to like stretch a little bit as far as, and I think Earache was definitely more, monetarily focused, but they also had some decent like diversity back then. Not like the shit show it is right now with like this, I don't even know what you'd call that stuff. Like modern classic rock or something. Yeah,
the Blackberry Rock, or I don't know what that band is. Cranberry goodness.
Boring. But they start out with like Lawnmower Death and Old Lady Drivers and shit. So there's like this weird, punkish kind of sensibility, but this
Doom was peaceful. Sorry, I was having a brain fart there.
But this stuff was like, it was undeniable how like catchy, and this came out same time as like Ned's Atomic Despon, which is another one of those bands that like everybody liked that I knew. Helmet, like it was like a heavy band, but it wasn't like growling.
Yeah, for sure.
And it was like a little heavier than some of the more alternative quote unquote stuff that was coming out of Seattle area and stuff.
I kind of like think too. I wrote down. I wrote. I wonder if you and Chris like got your skateboarder friends into it, and you just kind of already answered it when you saw with your
this
story.
This might have even been one of those things where they talked about it in Thrasher or something too, because they had a pretty eclectic taste in the music review department. It'd be like Public Enemy next to Carcass and stuff. And
you think that's like where some of you got some of your cues to sort of diversify was from something like Thrasher, where it's like, oh, if Thrasher kind of like digs it, then it's probably under the like the cool umbrella a little bit.
I think it was more validation that it was okay to have a weird taste.
And I had stuff like that, like with Metal Maniacs, or, you know, I'll be honest, like sometimes if it was on a Concrete Corner tape next to like stuff I liked, I was like, well, I'm willing to give this fucking band I've never heard of a chance, you know, and just think about it a little. Or even if it was on Headbangers Ball, let's be honest. I mean, Headbangers Ball and MTV were big tastemakers, you know?
Yeah, and they did have, they had 2 videos, I believe.
And it's so funny because Albert Mudrin, who we'll hear from in part 2 as well, made reference to that. And I have zero memory. And I was watching the Ball back then. So I don't know how I missed them or if I just like didn't, I don't know. It was weird because we were way into Helmet and all that stuff, but I just never.
I don't think it was played it wasn't in the rotation as much. I don't know how they picked, if that was actually like, you know, Rackman or whoever was doing it actually had some kind of input on what was going to be there, or if it was more just like which PR person hammered them the most or, you know, paid the most money to get stuff on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
it might have only been, you know, played a couple times.
Well, it's funny because I was writing down like my thoughts of my first memories of Fudge Tunnel, and I remember seeing the Creep Diets like cover, but none of us like bought it. And it's weird because we had a lot of trust in Earache at that point, but Fudge Tunnel didn't seem to be mentioned in the same circles as Cathedral and Carcass and Bolt Thrower and other Earache kind of acts. So we we were cautious until, you know, we didn't really have anybody in our lives like you guys had that was like gatekeeping for us at that point. We had to make all those choices kind of on our own, and we just never took a shot. And for me, it was a buddy of mine, Paul Dyer, that was in a band called Nickel Shot, and they were kind of a big local band.
The infamous Nickel Shot, yes.
Yeah, and Paul Dyer and I went to two of my first 3 concerts were with Paul. He and I drove down to see Orange 9mm and Deftones at St. Andrews. And he played Futility in the car. And I was like, this is fucking great. This is like everything I like. He's like, oh yeah, I read about Fudge Tunnel and they said like, if you like Helmet and you like this and Clutch and blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, this is like right fucking up our alley in 1994 with what, you know, Grindcore Coon and I were kind of listening to, which is
totally,
you know, heavy alternative. We were starting to dabble into death metal a bit, but we weren't like, you know, we had our hands in a lot of those cookie jars. I mean, we were sophomores in high school. So we were like at that perfect, like, you know, we were listening to Danzig 3 and COC and Slayer and, you know, all that stuff kind of. And so that's kind of what got me into Fudge Tunnel. And, you know, it wasn't like Hate Songs wasn't something you just like ran into either, you know, even though it was on Earache, like unless you bought it back in 91, it wasn't really like floating around. It wasn't something like people were restocking the way they were maybe restocking like Altars of Madness, you know?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's no contest as far as like units moved
for sure
between those two for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's just weird because they had the cachet of Earache and even like Creep Diets being like a Columbia thing. And it's funny because we did pull the trigger on every single one of those Columbia releases except for this one, and I just don't know why.
I mean, the name is stupid.
Yeah, maybe it was.
And when you don't like, I didn't put the 2 and 2 together of, you know, like British sarcasm and absurd humor and stuff. And that was one of the reasons I didn't like a lot of punk stuff, is because it had too much of a sense of humor, and I thought it was cooler to be serious about stuff.
Yeah, that's
true. Serious about, you know, devils and demons and all this fake shit.
But,
you know, when you're like 14 years old, you know, you're not really very wise in the ways of the world.
Exactly. Yeah. Did you guys ever interview these guys or any of the in the old Requiem days because of their connections with Earache, or were they just?
I don't think so. I mean, Chris might have been something that I'm not aware of, but we saw him. I think we saw him at least twice, but for sure we saw him. It was Clutch, Sepultura, Fudge Tunnel, and Fear Factory.
Oh wow!
And I took some of the best photos I ever took in my early photography career of them. I've got this one. It's like a red light right on Alex when he's got super long hair. I've got a picture of it. I'll throw it online at some point.
Oh, cool.
But I had a photo pass for that show, so I had a bunch of photos because they were playing first. And usually with photo passes, at least then, they'd only give you the first 3 songs.
Yeah.
So I've got a bunch of really good shots. I was like right, in his face taking photos. So there's some pretty good shots of that.
It's weird, like those, those concerts where, and again, Sepultura was pretty big by that point, but the other three bands were just kind of like, obviously, getting going.
Mm-hmm.
But it is weird how much access you had to some of those bands back in the day,
Yeah.
That show we went to see the Deftones play, like that's the one where Deftones were like a nobody band. I mean, they were the headliner, but they were still like not like super huge. Adrenaline had just come out, and we were way into Adrenaline. And we were fucking around before the show started. Like, I think we got there early. We're high school kids, so we have nowhere to go. We don't know, like, we're not going to walk around by St. Andrews in 1994 or 5. We're scared out of our minds. So like we were just kind of like in the lobby, and Deftones was like sound checking, and we just kind of were watching them. And Chino was like, "Hey, do you know any Deftones songs?" to Paul, and he's like, "Yeah, actually I do." And they're like, "Hey, get up on stage." And so like I just watched like my friend like play guitar with Deftones, and I, as like a 15-year-old, like I was mind blown. I was like, "Whoa!" Like, it was before I met you and Chris, and like didn't really understand like that you could access these people. You know what I mean? To me, they seemed like the idea of like a rock band like was like so far away from me. Like, how would you even get a chance to talk to those guys?
Yeah.
And now, like, before we record it, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm talking to Max Cavalera on Thursday if you want to talk to him. And you're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get something going, Dan Swano. And it's like, oh, they're just fucking normal people, and you just have to like, I don't know. It was like I was still mystified by the whole thing, and it's still cool. It'd be cool at age 43 for like a band to call one of my buddies up on stage and jam, that doesn't go away. But I think like the mystery of who these bands were and like the access you had to them seemed like so foreign to me. Like I was like, how would you even like think about talking to Slayer? You know what I mean? Like
totally
makes sense.
Yeah.
And then when I saw Requiem for the first time at New Moon Records, I was like, whoa. These guys live in Mount Pleasant and they're talking to like Opeth and Typo Negative. I was like, what the fuck? Cathedral? All of a sudden it was like all bets were off. And then like, then going to shows with you guys and, like, hey, My Dying Bride invited us backstage at the bowling alley, cool. Like, let's fucking go. And I'm just talking like about X-Files with like Aid or somebody like that. And it was just like, this is like really cool. Like I was still in high school. So it was like really mind blowing to me. And by the time I got to college, once I talked to Chuck and, you and I were hanging out with Anathema and, just different things. I was like, okay, this is all kind of normal now,
Cause growing up, you see like, Led Zeppelin, Metallica and stuff. You're like,
there's no way.
What the hell? Yeah.
Yeah. Why would those guys want to talk to me?
DIY ethic of a lot of this stuff. Cause when we first started doing the zine too, we weren't even dealing with labels yet. We were just dealing with, you'd find somebody's address, here's Dan Swano's address in the back of Nothing But Death Remains. Let's send him a letter and see if he wants to answer questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then eventually you get a couple zines on, you're like, hey, we can just, then like sometimes the labels would get a hold of you because there wasn't that many zines. There might have been a couple hundred or something. I don't know at that point. But yeah, it was just a really organic process until like, oh shit, I'm talking to Corthon from Bathory tomorrow. I'm talking to Barry from Bolt Thrower. I was like losing my shit, but
yeah. I remember how nervous I was before I got on the tour bus with Chuck, and I was like, oh my god, this guy's like, he's like the godfather of death metal, and he's just like,
man, like,
hey man, how's it
cool.
going? Yeah, he's like a fucking surfer dude from Florida, like just a total like chill dude, man. So and that like. Yeah. Once I got through that, I was like, oh, and then like talking to Hansi, that was probably for, like talking to Hansi was probably like you talking to Bolt Thrower for the first time. You're like, what? This guy's a legend, for us. So, but pretty cool. So, but yeah, so we speaking of access to people, I did reach out to Alex, but he, he kind of, I think he has, I don't want to speak for him, but he doesn't necessarily want to talk about a lot about Fudge Tunnel in those sort of regards and stuff. He's doing a lot of production stuff, which is awesome. I think he's building a new studio and stuff. But
he's got a pretty insane discography of bands he's produced too.
Yeah, for sure. And so, but luckily there was kind of a serendipitous kind of timing that Alex, right around that time when he really didn't have time to do an interview, shared this post on Facebook about a thing that he was doing on Tidal, which is, you said it was a Swedish like music.
It's a Norwegian American
Norwegian. Okay.
Joint collaboration, I guess.
It's kind of Spotify-esque or whatever, and I don't really know much about it, but basically a music service that he was posting some kind of playlist where he was going to basically talk a lot about the bands and songs that influenced Hate Songs in E minor. And I was like, oh, bingo, that's pretty cool. Mm-hmm. So I got signed up to listen to him talk about his kind of musical influences and stuff like that. And especially since Fudge Tunnel is like so unique within the heavy scene of the early 90s, I think it helped give us like a little bit better context in terms of where Alex and Adrian and David were kind of coming from. And so, he does like 48 tracks total without any music. And then I think depending on which version of title you sign up with, they'll sometimes insert the songs that he's kind of referencing too. And so it's kind of cool. And so that's one of the things we'll be doing is like offering a lot of context, very similar for those of you that have been with us for a while to how we approached Neurosis, when the first two parts were basically us kind of giving a lot of the backstory of what led Neurosis to Through Silver and Blood in terms of influences and progression of the band and things like that. So it'll be a little bit different. We're weaving a lot of different things in, and hopefully it has kind of a story flow. And Alex, at certain points from the title thing, will be kind of a little bit of our MC through some of that as well. And then, like I said, we're also talking to David and be dropping him in at various points, and it's going to be fun. Yeah. So if you're interested in hearing the whole thing, I mean, we're not playing obviously, the lion's share of the title thing. I think it's really worth, like subscribing to if you do dig Fudge Tunnel and checking out that thing that Alex curated. I think it's really cool. So, even if you just sign up for a month or two and check it out, go for it. So, so pretty cool. I'm excited for that. And it's funny too, because I kind of mentioned to you that it's probably like one of the only times that we'll be talking about some of these bands ever on Requiem Metal podcast. So it's kind of a fun little opportunity, and like you said, one of the things that we're going to hear the very first thing from Alex before we go in this next set of music and stuff like that is him just sort of in general, just kind of talking about like the bands that were like formative to him picking up a guitar and stuff like that. He'll talk about Black Sabbath and Gang of Four and some other stuff. So it's not just about stuff specifically for Hate Songs, their debut, but also just like how he kind of became a musician. And that's cool. We always like to do the backstory on where people are coming from, especially as historians and stuff like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing, like right off the bat, like he was, like 17 or something when they first started, and the other guys are in their mid-20s.
Yeah.
He's like this kind of this little, like this wunderkind. So it's kind of an interesting setup.
So we kind of mentioned that this is back, actually it was only last year. It was actually March of 2021. Decibel did a Fudge Tunnel Hall of Fame. Our good friend Nick Green, who we'll be hearing from in part 2, inducted Hate Songs. And so I wanted to read to you a little excerpt from that. It's the very first question that Nick asks is basically like the early years of Fudge Tunnel a bit. And since we're kind of getting the backstory, and here's what the three guys kind of had to say. Alex says, anytime you start a band, you need at least 12 months and probably 18 or 24 before you really find your sound. Even if you go into it with a specific intention. Dave and I were much more into the aggressive Chicago sound, the Jesus Lizard, Big Black, bands like that. Adrian in particular loved all the DC hardcore stuff. We all loved Dinosaur Jr., particularly the first couple of albums. Fudge Tunnel would not exist without You're Living All Over Me. It was a huge influence. When we first started, that's pretty much what we were trying to do, but we couldn't play like that. And we reached a point where we wondered why we'd want to replicate the sound of another band. So there was definitely a year of writing songs and encountering frustrations before we hit upon something that felt like us. From that point on, the focus was on simpler song structures and more aggressive playing. So, and that's Alex's kind of standpoint. And I know in talking to Nick before we did all this, I was kind of like asking Nick, like, do you think these guys would talk? You did the Hall of Fame. And he was like, well, reach out to Alex on Facebook and maybe find the other two guys on their Facebook page as well, or their website, I think. And he said, it's interesting. They mentioned in that interview that the band wouldn't exist without You're Living All Over Me from Dinosaur Jr., which is one of my favorite of their records. And he goes, and it got me thinking, like, maybe I should explore this record a little bit more. And so Nick's digging around into that record, he said, right now. So it's pretty cool.
Oh, good. That's cool.
Yeah. And then Adrian said, I'd given up on music before Fudge Tunnel. Dave might have been in the same place. We'd both kicked around in bands for years. I was 24 and Dave is a few years older than me. I couldn't believe how young Alex was when I met with him. He was only 17, just like you said, Mark. But he had some great ideas. The two of us got together and started jamming first. We auditioned a couple of bass players before Dave turned up. We were a 4-piece for a short time with another guitarist named Mark, but that didn't work out. We felt that a power trio lineup would work best. None of us in Fudge Tunnel were exceptional musicians. The sum was greater than the parts. That shaped the sound as well. If you have limitations, you find ways to work within them, and hopefully something interesting comes out. And then Dave says, I was the last to join. They had been rehearsing with another bass player, and I think he wanted to switch to guitar. So they put an ad on a notice board at the Nottingham record shop, which I answered. After a couple of rehearsals, the other guy left to do another band, leaving the three of us. At that point, there was a lot of jamming and Sonic Youth-esque noise. At some point, me and Alex realized that we actually lived just a few streets away from each other. So I went round to his place and checked out his record collection. As I remember, the real touchstones were Killdozer, Big Black, and Black Flag. As it turned out, Adrian also had a particularly massive record collection, so we were never short on inspiration. After a few months of practicing, we started to add some more structure to the noise and actually made some songs, which we recorded and put out a demo tape. At that point, though, it still didn't sound much like Hate Songs in E minor. So it's the origin story. And I feel like in a lot of the clips that I heard that we're using with Alex and some of the other ones I just listened to that we're not using, he does mention like Adrian's records a lot. So I don't know. It's always like cool. Like, you know, I'm sure you guys had like the friend, I don't know who it was, who just always seemed to have like the latest, greatest kind of newest kind of stuff. I know Chris talks a lot about Dave Messick, would always like be buying like a lot of stuff right away.
It became me and Chris.
Yeah, you guys became those guys. In a sense, like that's kind of
tape trading too. Like, you know, like a longtime friend of the show, like Dan Zadar, would always like send a crazy tape. Like, how the hell did you get this? He's like,
yeah, you seem to be cutting edge on stuff. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and I think, you know, for within our age group, because I'm, you know, a few years younger than Mark and Chris, it was definitely probably us, you know, at least in the high school. We were kind of like I don't know. That's why I was making mixtapes for like everyone, you know, and I could make them with metal. I could make them with like indie rock, alternative. I could mix the two together, and people seem to be
you definitely had like a more diverse palette across, like you were knowledgeable in more than just like, you know, extreme death metal.
Sure.
So.
Yeah. Well, and I was trying to like also impress girls, and I realized like death metal was not often a good pathway to like impressing girls. So
I mean, now it might be. I mean, I see so many girls at shows as I do dudes. So.
I know, it's crazy. We grew up in the wrong time. I fucked up, but that's all right. You know what though? Some of those girls turned me on to some like cool fucking shit. In fact, some of the music we're playing in this episode, like I discovered from like girls I dated who like turned me on to. Oh boy, there's something we're hearing later. For me, like Bauhaus and The Cure and Sisters of Mercy are all from girls that I knew were dated. Yeah. Leave it to them to like kind of open up those sort of goth doorways and stuff.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah, for sure. Oh, I know who it was. It was Jesus and Mary Chain. Mary Chain. I almost said Jesus and Mary Lizard. I don't know what the fuck. I was thinking Jesus Lizard and Jesus and Mary Chain combined. So it's been a long week for me. This is my toughest time of year. Mark, having lived with me for a few years, knows that May is basically like a lost cause for me as a human being in terms of my quality of life.
I was just living by myself, basically.
Yeah, basically, like I was just like in and out and be like, oh yeah, you know. I can only imagine if I had tracked still. That's the crazy part. Like, how the fuck did I do this and coach? But you know, luckily, I'm not doing that.
Let things go
in the spring, you know. So. But yeah, basically from there, we get the first two releases. You know, Sex Mammoth is a 4-song 7-inch that's put out by Pig Boy in 1989. And then a year later on Pig Boy, they put out a 12-inch called Sweet Sound of Excess. And so, you know, some pretty great song titles. You know, there's a song called Best Friend's Wife, Shit for Brains, Like Jeff. You know, like that's such a fucking strange song, you know? And so, yeah, I think they had a combination of kind of the punk rock, kind of indie rock kind of humor mixed with that sort of dry British wit, you know? And that was kind of they always seem to be taking a piss out of like different things, you know? And Alex will kind of talk about that in some later interview clips, that he almost like didn't want to be liked as a band in some ways. That was like street cred almost, you know?
Yeah. Well,
And
they
it's
even
funny.
have that thing inside of Hate Songs where it says none of the lyrics on this album mean anything. So
Yeah.
don't waste your time.
Yeah, don't even fucking bother. Yeah. And it's funny, I've been reading the new Chuck Klosterman book, and
Is it the 90s one?
Yeah, the 90s one. I picked it up because, you know, being a child of the 90s, and I'm actually teaching a new class next year that's on pop culture. And so I'm kind of interested in generational, you know, things. And there's things he's writing in there that's like, it's so us. It's so like, not just like us in terms of you and I, but like it's people who grew up in that era. And it's like this idea, like the idea of selling out. Like when I explain selling out to like students now, it doesn't make any sense to them. They don't get why anybody would fucking give a shit. And I think you had to grow up in a very certain kind of time period where there was like a sacredness to like, oh my God, REM signed to a mainstream label. Oh my God, U2 is putting out like commercial music. Oh my God, Nirvana. Like that was like a death knell, and there was like a code. And now who cares? Kids don't give a shit. Kids like what they like.
Back then you actually had to take the time to learn and research all this stuff. You can't just go on Wikipedia, you know, back then and figure out, I have a rough understanding of G Mascis and Dinosaur Jr. right now. Like you had to go to the record store.
Yeah.
You'd have to know people that you could read liner notes. You have to find interviews and Maximum Rock, like wherever the fuck you could find anything. Like now it's a totally different, the access to I think that's what it was, is the access to information was more, you know, gatekept, because it's like, hey, I spent all this time
I had to
figuring
fight
this
for
out.
this.
Why the fuck do you guys get it now?
But I just feel like Alex is of our generation, you know what I mean? And I feel like him, like his idea of like, I purposely don't want this to be like mainstream and stuff. Like there's really nothing wrong if it was mainstream. And that's like something that like people kind of had to like act, you know, like wrap their heads around when it came to like, you know, the Soundgardens and Alice in Chains. Like you can do both, you know what I mean? Like it can be, you can, but it was like, I think our generation and that kind of 90s Gen X kind of like, it was like anathema to do that. And I don't know, it was just something that it kind of clicked with me with some of the things in researching kind of Alex's attitudes towards the band in that era. And he's probably changed his thoughts on that now, just as like you and I have probably evolved to the point where it's like, you know, who cares if something's popular? If it's good, it's good, you know?
Well, I think a lot of that is trying to like, saying that you don't care is trying to brace you for people not caring.
That
ultimately you make stuff because you want people to see it or you want to share it. Otherwise you'd never put it anywhere outside of just like, if people really did music just for themselves, they wouldn't put it on in records.
Yep. So it's like what you're saying is it's kind of like we're like overcompensating for like the insecurity that we have about whether or not this will be rejected or not.
Exactly. That's how I would feel about it, because I'd always this is a shit, but if you want to look at it, that's cool. But ultimately you want to connect with people. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's where I get my self-deprecating humor from, is definitely being like a Gen X type fucking slacker type character. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you bringing that kind of up about the idea of kind of searching out records and how the hunt for it. I was just listening to, there's a really, really fantastic series called The History of Rock in 500 Songs. It's from a British guy, and it's so well researched. It's sort of like what he's doing, I want to do with heavy metal. Like maybe when I retire, like it's fucking like incredible. But I was listening to an episode on early Bob Dylan, and they were kind of talking about how one of the problems like that Dylan and some of these like guys had is like they didn't re-release records. So like when Dylan was like discovering like Leadbelly and Woody Guthrie, like you couldn't just like even walk into a record store and buy those records. Like they didn't keep them around.
Yeah.
Like you had to know someone who maybe had them, or a record company had to re-release those songs back into circulation. And I think at least you and I had like used shops, so we could like find old stuff. But like you think about buying records in like the late 50s, like whatever was new was out. Like you weren't going to like used record shops at that point that had like any sense of history or curation.
Yeah, I mean, even
like,
in the 80s, like the best before, like pre-eBay, you could use like Goldmine magazine or something to buy stuff. But
and so I think at least we were lucky enough to have that. Like I can't imagine if you were a musician, and that's probably why the musicians were like ripping each other off without even knowing they're ripping each other off sometimes, because like the knowledge factory and the communication was so like chopped up in a way that you might be like writing a riff that you think is yours, and then someone's like, you know, that riff's like, you know, is on this like weird garage rock song from 1961 over here, and you're like, what the fuck? Like, ah, oh, damn it. You know, it's really strange. So that kind of, I think I knew that instinctively, but just the way it was laid out and explained, to the fact that like, if you were hungry to know about the past, like nobody knew who Robert Johnson was until they re-released his album in 1961. And then that like kind of was, you know, sort of serendipitous with him being discovered by all like the young British teenagers. And like, the reason we talk about Robert Johnson is not because he actually had that much influence on rock and roll, but it's the fact that like a bunch of the like white teenagers who defined like hard rock in the second half of the 60s, they discovered him in the early 60s and made him into something much more mythical to their journey into being rock stars than I think was actually true of the real story of rock. And that's something like, fuck, I've been teaching rock and roll history wrong. I remember just like having like this moment where I was like, fuck, I need to tell Mike about this. Cause like Mike taught me that, and I'm just teaching it based off like our old record store manager who also teaches rock history. And so I was like, shit, this just like realigns some of my perspectives on stuff. And it's just interesting, like where you find your history. And now like with the internet, it's all there. But back in the day, it's fucking tough.
I mean, even with like, you know, I didn't discover Doom. You know, I heard Sabbath and stuff before, but I didn't hear anything about Witchfinder General or Trouble or Pentagram. It was like my entry point was Cathedral, and then I went, you know, backwards. Now you can get a complete understanding of death metal in, you know, a couple hours screwing around on Facebook or on the YouTube and you know, Metal Archives, and see who was in what. Like, it was a novelty for me to try to come up with like, I was going to do the Swedish metal family tree kind of thing.
I remember.
We kept like going through all of our books and cross-referencing, like, holy shit, he was in this and then this and that. Now you can just go to Metal Archives and figure out exactly.
Yeah, you don't have to guess anymore.
Yeah, but it's just we have all this information now. It's just like matter, like, what do we do with it?
Yeah.
Make something interesting out of it, because we don't. I think just those brief cursory evaluations of stuff doesn't give you that same kind of like. It doesn't. I don't think it satisfies you the same way as like. That's probably why we're doing these shows that are, you know, 6-7 hours long.
Yeah,
it's because we're like digging the surface on stuff, and then we keep digging and digging and digging until we really understand it.
Well, just
but
think
I think
of
a lot
like
of people just kind of dip in a little bit.
Yeah, and I think think about like what was available to us in terms of research material in 2008. Like, not much.
No, like liner notes and CDs, like magazines we had.
I mean, I think one of the impetuses, I would say, probably for us starting to think in this, I mean, I can speak to this, and, you know, Albert, if you're listening, I think you will, like, this is props. I think when I read Choosing Death, it realigned like how to think about the history of the music that I was into, because I suddenly was like, oh, this is being documented for like the first time. And it like legitimized it in like a way that I wanted to legitimize this. Like, I feel like I've been apologizing for this music and defending it so passionately with like intellect, you know, like you and I are kind of intellectuals, you know, we've always been drawn to like, you know, analysis and dissecting the things that we get into. And people that met us, and I'm sure you encountered this too, you know, people that met me sometimes would be like, wait, you're like into like death metal? Like, you don't seem like that kind of person, like with your temperament and how you dress and stuff. I'm like, yeah, but like there's an intellectual side to it. It doesn't have to be just boneheaded, like thrashing stuff.
It's not just about beating each other up in the pit.
Yeah. And I kind of thought like you and me and Chris and just a few other people we met like at Relapse, you know, like Jeff and you know, a few of those people were kind of like in the minority. And it seems like when Choosing Death came out, I was like, oh, this was the book that was written for people like us. And I was like, this is cool. Like, you can do this. And then I think like within a couple of years, you were like, hey, do you want to do this podcast? And it was like, yeah, like, let's document stuff. And again, we didn't have like good research yet, but we were kind of learning and getting our feet under us.
It was just like when we first started the zine, it was like we were doing it out of enthusiasm, not out of, you know, we figured out how to eventually write better and, you know, craft the magazine in a way that wasn't so naive. But I think, yeah, early on, you just start out with enthusiasm. That's all you got. Yep. And eventually you get better if you stick with it.
What's funny, like speaking of this, the same kid that went on the Voivod Celtic Frost journey with me, he was kind of like talking to me the other day. He's like, I can't really wrap my head around like post punk. It's like something. He's like, I just it doesn't do much for me. And I kind of said, yeah, I think when I was your age, I was kind of in the same boat. I didn't really know what to do with it. And I said, I think when you're kind of younger, like you want like sugar energy. And that's kind of what
nothing immediate about it.
And death metal is. It's like it's like a sugar rush. It's like instantaneous, like energetic, like in your face. And I think as we get older, I think I'm speaking for both of us, but I think you agree. Like, our tastes get more subtle, and we have more of a palette to sort of like understand a band like Joy Division or Gang of Four, or those
totally.
kind of
like
bands.
I had a diversion today where I was just listening to the Wipers for about a half hour.
Yeah, there you go. Absolutely.
It's like, oh, these guys are great.
Yeah. So I think like that's kind of what we're sort of talking about is, you start off with just a sort of youthful energy, and then you kind of evolve a little bit.
Well, and it's like looking at the big touchstones too, that are easy to understand. Like you can understand the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, but then like, the next thing down is like, Velvet Underground, the Stooges are a little, more dissonant and not necessarily as easy to digest.
Yeah.
And it goes across like all, depths of subgenres and types of music.
Yeah, I mean, I've been processing Bob Dylan for 30 years of my life, and I'm still like unpacking that package, and that's cool because I get more and more out of him every year when I'm teaching stuff. I mean, I've been teaching the Beatles for 12 years in rock and roll history, and last year I just unpacked a song off of Sgt. Pepper for like really the first time. And as I did it, like I was like, I had tears like rolling down my face because I suddenly realized like how beautiful the song was. And I realized that when I was going to play it and explain it to my students, I was going to have like girls like crying in the class, because it's basically about a daughter saying goodbye to her parents because she doesn't agree with like their politics, and she loves them and she's thanking them for everything that they've done and all the sacrifices they've made, but she's got to go. And like, I was like, dude, there are some of my students living in Armada that really relate to this, because there's a very much kind of like the 60s, a very distinct generational division that's starting to kind of happen with kind of how politics are shifting in this country.
Well,
and there's a lot of
politics are in every aspect of everything in the country now.
Sure.
It didn't used to be.
And I think it was a little in the 60s, but yeah, I think you're right.
But it wasn't like in every possible thing. Like every movie you see has some type of little, nod to this or that, or,
Well, I think
nothing is pure entertainment or mythology anymore.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I think what you're seeing similar to like maybe the 60s is like, there's like kind of a line in the sand. Like you have a generation like in the 60s that like is for Jim Crow, and like younger people are like, no, like there's not even a compromise. Like we can't be like half Jim Crow. And I think, the stuff that you just saw with the Supreme Court and these just different things, I think you're going to see that where like the younger people are just like this, like they've, teaching the last couple of weeks and with all the Roe v. Wade stuff, it's been fascinating. Like the conversations that like female students are having, they're like, what the fuck's going on? Like, this doesn't make any logical sense. I said, well, welcome to it. Like, it's time to fight. Like, this is like, if this is your political awakening, here we go. Like, it's game on, because you better be plugged in.
Once it was a leak too. So we don't really know what, and it's, midterm elections is another reason. But also like I was listening to this thing today, and I was flipping through random radio stations because I couldn't find the damn NPR station. I was like, I forgot what the call numbers were for the Ann Arbor version, because the Detroit one's too much like music that I don't care about.
Oh, yeah.
Flipping through, and I found there was some other, like, it might have got onto AM, but they were talking like apparently John Roberts might put out a dissenting opinion, but not quite as. But it's going to be some really kind of sugar coated thing.
That's what they think. Yeah, they think that they think the leak was probably done by Clarence Thomas's wife, who also probably had something to do with the insurrection, and they did it to like bully John Roberts into not releasing his like kind of counter to it or whatever, to almost like scare him. But I think it's going to actually have like maybe not the intention that they had, but that's a whole deeper conversation that we don't want to kind of turn this into. But yeah. But it's really interesting. Like I said, with that Beatles song, like that's like a song I've lived with for a long time. And then suddenly I just like heard it for the first time. I was like, fuck. This is going to blow my students away. Yeah,
like with watching film, like listening to music, like even the stuff like you kind of liked, and then you go back and you can hear it in a completely different way.
Yeah.
Like I think like just gaining your vocabulary of music and film, whatever you're into, even if it's like, carpentry or plumbing or something, like you figure you have all these little touchstone moments that eventually like, oh my God, that's why this works this way. Or that's why, that's what makes this specific thing so incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially, because art changes as your perspective changes. I think like, when you're young and you don't really have like a perspective about like getting old or family, movies about like that experience don't like appeal to you. But like as you get older, you watch your parents get older, you start to like be more connected to like that kind of storytelling or whatever. And it's pretty interesting.
Didn't you just see Cocoon lately though, and it didn't do anything for you?
Well, it was fine. It was entertaining. Yeah. I get what it was trying to do, and I imagine
I haven't seen it since I was a kid, but I really liked old people movies for some reason back then.
Like Batteries Not Included.
Yeah, there seemed to have been anything with like Don Amici or
yeah, for sure. Yeah,
or the Tough Guys with Kirk Douglas and.
It's sort of like the end of like the vaudeville like kind of people's like run. Right.
Yeah, grumpy old men.
Yeah. Milton Berle was kind of like making his like final appearances and things like, Grumpy Old Men. Yeah. I love Grumpy Old Men.
It's great. The ending credits are fantastic with Burgess Meredith.
Yep. But I guess I don't know what led us on this, but I guess where we were is this idea that like Fudge Tunnel really has like this strong kind of ironic detachment kind of humor. It's always sort of present, and I think that in a way linked them. I think you're right. What you said at the beginning of the episode, more to indie rock, alt grunge scenes, because all of those had ironic detachment. Like, for us, like seeing Nirvana do the video for In Bloom, where they're making fun of the Beatles on Ed Sullivan's show, was like ironic detachment. And we were here for it. So like I was raised with ironic detachment humor. So like when Weezer's doing Buddy Holly, I was like, or Beastie Boys are doing Sabotage. Like that was the greatest video I'd ever seen in my life. And it's all ironic detachment about 70s cop cliches and things. And nowadays we live in a postmodern world where like everything's fucking, like Community and that stuff is like doing like meta.
Yeah.
And that's cool. I like that stuff probably because I'm a Gen Xer. But again, I think like Fudge Tunnel, like you said, didn't take things seriously, and that's probably why they didn't relate to political grindcore or death metal or some of the other things that were happening on Earache and around them. They were kind of like a fish out of water. They didn't really have kind of like a scene, you know what I mean?
But also, like when I was younger, I didn't, outside of the name, there was no lyrics, and the song titles just seemed like whatever, kind of obtuse. But if you just listen to the music and like the intent, like the delivery of the vocals, it seems pretty serious to like a young person. Just because of the intensity of everything. But
yeah, absolutely.
And I was trying to I couldn't find lyrics for anything on that first record at all.
No, I kind of looked around too, and there's just really not much there. And I just figured, you know what, that's maybe for the best. It's just like one less thing we have to kind of deal with.
I've always had my own ideas what certain things were.
Yeah.
But now I'm like questioning myself. I was like, I don't know, is that what the 302-101? What the hell does that mean? Like,
yeah, that's funny.
I have no idea.
Funny. So basically what we're going to kind of hear is we will hear from that early era that I mentioned, those first two kind of releases before Hate Songs comes out. We will hear a pair of tunes from the 1990 John Peel sessions, including Sex Mammoth, that's going to be in this first set of music. And then we'll hear another tune from the 90 Peel session, I think in the second set of music that we'll get to. But kind of here's the journey we're going on. The first thing we're going to hear is from Gang of Four, a song called What We All Want from Solid Gold in 81. And for people that don't know, they were an English post-punk band from Leeds. Andy Gill doing kind of shimmering guitar, but they had really great kind of funk, almost like krautrock funk kind of bass lines from Dave Allen. And then John King was kind of doing these like killer kind of hooks with really kind of fierce leftist messages. I remember Chris True kind of got me into Gang of Four back in college a bit. Mm-hmm. I had Entertainment, and I think I had Solid Gold. And I kind of knew they were like, people always compared them to Wire. And I was like a little bit more maybe into Wire back in college. Because Minor Threat was covering Wire and things like that. And I knew that Gang of Four had a huge influence on Fugazi, and I was a huge Fugazi fan too. And Alex likes them and thinks that this tune actually inspires One of the other songs we're gonna hear from Hate Songs, which is a tune called Tweezers, and he'll tell the story about what aspects of Gang of Four kind of come into Tweezers. But
Well, and also
apparently there's
Gang of Four's got a little bit of "I Was Made for Loving You" bass line happening.
that's what I mean. That's that sort of like the funky, yeah, like
And
they
like
kind
the
of like
Talking
disco
Heads
funk
television
kind of
vocals and
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, they were just they were way more political than television and Talking Heads were in terms of like being like all out kind of like
they were
almost
the
like
art school
Marxist
guys.
Yeah. They were more like Marxist type characters. But Tweezers was the first video that they did, and I never saw
I just saw it today on YouTube, but I never saw it anywhere else.
Yeah, it's like a low budget kind of thing they did with some friends, I guess. But how was it? I didn't watch the video.
It just kind of looks like
early
a
90s
black
video.
and white, very like, it looked like something like Soundgarden what the hell's that stupid song called?
Oh, Outshine?
I was
Or
trying to
something
say Uncaged.
like that? Yeah. Well,
But it's just like this
Cage
black and white, like,
yeah.
zooming in, zooming out.
Sure.
You know,
like a classic
typical.
video you'd see on Alternative Nation, 120 minutes,
Exactly. Yeah. It's like basically like the opener of 120 minutes is kind of how it looked.
There you go. And I could definitely hear like the Gang of Four influence, especially in the midsection of this tune for sure.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of big kind of like Melvins riffs and noise rock. And he'll talk more about the Melvins later in the episode for sure. But it's a fun one. And I mean, Hate Songs is like their quintessential, I guess their classic record, but there's a lot of variety to Hate Songs too. Like even though the songs at first like seem samey, they are doing some like different things that I think Alex helps kind of pick apart in some of these little commentaries that he gives that I thought was kind of interesting, And from Tweezers, from Hate Songs, we'll then go to Bauhaus, and Alex will tell us about getting into Bauhaus and the influence that that sort of had, and a tune called "She's in Parties," and they're from Northampton, another area of England. I don't think I've been to Northampton. I think I've been through Leeds, and I don't think I've been to Nottingham, where Fudge Tunnel's from. But anyways,
I don't think there's a lot to see there.
Yeah, I don't think there's much going on there. But just again, started off sort of a post-punk kind of band, and then sort of took on more kind of goth, kind of indie vibes. Their real big breakthrough was in '79 with Bela Lugosi's "Dead." That kind of was an accidental big kind of breakthrough sort of hit.
Sure.
Peter Murphy, iconic vocals, but the guy that Alex really sort of, hones in on is David Ash and the things he's doing with his real kind of psychedelic, kind of noisy, eerie guitar playing. I think the bass, like a lot of the stuff when I was listening to, like, okay, what are these, like, what's he pulling out of these? And a lot of it seems it's like compositional stuff, like for Bauhaus, it's kind of like the air and the space and the bass propulsion is what I kind of got out of. Well, and Kevin Haskins is on drums, and David J was the bass player. And I wrote, they're a nice rhythm section, and you can hear, especially in the back half of the song, just how like the rhythmic kind of intricacies of what they're sort of those two guys are doing. And I think, that's the cool takeaway. I think that he's pulling out from them a little bit too.
Well, that's really what, like, Fudge Tunnel is the guitar. The guitar is not the lead instrument. The guitar, like, it's the drums and the bass that are really structuring everything, and then he kind of like lays this texture over the top of everything. Like even the vocals are almost more of a percussive instrument than, like, the guitars just kind of accents things here and there and throws on that main riff.
I wonder if they had been sold more to like Primus fans. And again, they're not doing like Les Claypool type bass, but Primus was a different type of band in that the bass was the lead instrument, and they were kind of part of like the indie scene and the hard alternative scene. And
there was a lot. I mean, the bass was such a stronger instrument in all that stuff. In Pixies, in especially Fugazi, like, Jesus. Like,
yeah.
And even like going back to Ned's Atomic Dustbin, they had two bass players that were tuned like a octave apart or something. And then
I remember player. Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. Yeah, that
Jesus
is kind of
Jones. Like, a lot of the stuff of this era had a lot of that.
Sure. And I think a lot of that drew on like the post-punk, where post-punk really put the bass out like in the forefront a lot more. Whereas I think punk was like more guitar driven with like kind of the Ramones, Sex Pistols kind of style. I think that when you get to bands like The Clash, they kind of really opened up like a lot of the reggae influence, which was really rhythmic and bass driven and stuff like that. And it kind of opened up punk music, I think, a lot, in a cool way.
Yeah, that's something I didn't really realize. Like, post-punk just seemed kind of boring when I was younger. I was like, it's fine, whatever. But now seeing like that subtle, like, transformation is like, wow, this is like a really like a big growth.
And I think
These
it's
guys.
darker too. That's the cool
Absolutely,
part.
yeah.
You know, it's like drearier and more moody. And as I get older, like I'm drawn more, moody stuff, I think, sometimes.
I'm gonna
So
go see Bauhaus this summer. They're playing down in Detroit.
are they? Yeah, I'll go if I'm around. So I already realize I'm gonna miss Cave-In when they're in Detroit. That kind of bums me out.
Yeah, 3 blocks from my house. It's pretty cool.
I know. That's awesome. Yeah. If it weren't for cross country camp, I'd definitely be there. And so then we're going to go from Bauhaus into, I think alongside Dinosaur Jr. from what I gather, that this band is really like kind of who they identify as like trying to like formulate, and that's Husker Du. And speaking of my old friend Chris True, back from college, who I think Mark you knew from the record store a little bit too.
Yeah,
he was like the biggest Husker Du guy, Bob Mould, and he kind of turned me on to them back in college. And the song that Alex kind of talks about is "I'll Never Forget" from their kind of double album masterpiece Zen Arcade from '84, and it was sort of like it's kind of the Quadrophenia from the Who or the Blonde on Blonde from Dylan in terms of like hardcore, alt indie rock. There weren't a lot of double albums coming out of that scene, so that was pretty cool. They're from Minneapolis, again, a power trio similar to
Killdozer's from Minneapolis too, aren't they?
I think so too. Yeah. So that kind of Minneapolis, Chicago sound was, I think, really formative for Fudge Tunnel for sure. And you can, aesthetically, you hear a lot, I think, the textures of Husker Du, especially in Fudge Tunnel's kind of DNA. And I forgot, I was looking at pictures of Greg Norton, I think he's the bass player. And I said, Greg Norton accidentally gave birth to the douchebag hipster mustache. His ruled, but because it was like unique for its time. But now I see like they're a dime a dozen at like metal shows and stuff. It fucking bugs me. But
they're everywhere now. I saw 2 dudes walking.
Oh God!
When I was going to the store today,
yeah.
One guy looked like a dock worker. They look like they're dressed up as like different professions or something. Like one dude looked like a dock worker, the other guy looked like he was on on a chain gang or something. It's like, what the fuck are these people doing?
It's funny. And I think like, especially Husker Du, you can hear in Sex Mammoth, which you can hear all the Peel session stuff actually came out on a posthumous release that Earache put out called In a Word. It's got a couple Peel sessions and some live stuff or whatever, but that's where you can hear Sex Mammoth, the Peel session one. And I think like, Alex does a lot of Bob Mould kind of screams and uses a lot of his guitar tone, and you can hear that in Sex Mammoth a little bit.
Yeah.
And especially like Grant Hart's frantic drumming. Oh, sorry. Greg Norton was the bass player in Husker Du. Yeah. Grant Hart was the drummer. You can hear that a lot in Adrian's drumming, which is cool. There's sort of like the thing I always like thought about Husker Du is they were kind of, I don't know if this makes any sense, but they're kind of tweaky. Like they seem like they were like on like a little bit, they were edgy. Like they had like done a little bit of speed. And so they were like not comfortable. So like when they're playing like pop grooves, but like they're playing them like a little bit like too fast.
They're kind of like amped up and like hit.
Yeah. They're like that. Yeah. They're sort of tweaky a little bit, because the thing that was interesting about Husker Du that made them different from like other like hardcore bands of the time is they had melodies and things like that, and like girls were like kind of into Husker Du in ways that they weren't into Agnostic Front or, well,
because you could tell these people felt something outside of anger.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But they still had that hardcore edge to their music. So it was like melodic and catchy, but like still like little, like I said, tweaky. That's a new term I'm coming up with.
Yes.
I'm trademarking it. So I think this will give, we're going to hear 2 songs from Fudge Tunnel in the midst of some of these other tunes, but I think like through, Alex's guidance and stuff like that and linking these songs together, I think you'll start to kind of get like a good musical foundation of the pool that Fudge Tunnel is kind of drawing from. So, so let's get into it. We've got What We All Want from Gang of Four, Tweezers from Fudge Tunnel, She's in Parties from Bauhaus, I'll Never Forget You from Husker Du, and then we'll end with Sex Mammoth from the Peel sessions, and we'll hear from Alex all throughout all of this.
Black Who? Never heard of them, mate. Yeah, okay. Black Sabbath's pretty big influence, I would say. I think the thing about Sabbath is like they just had fantastic songs and not only great musicians, but unlike some of those bands at that time, they actually just had fantastic songs. And so for a while when I was a kid, I think I mentioned it earlier, but all I had for about a year was Gang of Four 12-inch and Paranoid by Black Sabbath. And I basically learned to play guitar from those two records badly. You know, I didn't really have much of an interest in doing the solo stuff because that was all a bit metal-y for me. I just loved the fuzzed out riffs and those sort of grooves that Sabbath had that are almost soulful, you know, grooves. I had a video of Sabbath live. I'm not sure where it's from, but I was like, I don't know, I was like 13 or something. And, you know, just trying to learn guitar. But I didn't know that Tony Iommi was a southpaw. So I'm watching this video and trying to sort of look at where he's putting his fingers, but I couldn't figure it out because everything was backwards. And I sort of tried my best to emulate what he was doing, but I think I ended up playing sort of wrong chord. Like I ended up playing like fourths instead of fifths or something. And that just stuck. And it's all over hate songs, me playing fourths where it should be fifths or whatever, because I couldn't really figure it out. growing up, there was a point I was probably 14 or 15 and I only had 2 records for the space of about a year when I started to learn guitar. And that was Gang of Four. It wasn't even Entertainment. I wasn't that cool because all I could afford was a 12-inch, which was I Love a Man in Uniform. And it wasn't until a couple of years later I heard Entertainment and Solid Gold. And then the other record I had was Paranoid by Black Sabbath. So essentially, you know, I sort of learned guitar from those 2 records, like the riffs of Sabbath and then the rhythm section and the sort of noisy, scratchy guitar from Gang of Four. And I just love how they wrote songs and how Andy Gill used the guitar as, you know, he made it sound not like a guitar and he sort of attacked it and got all these weird strangled sounds out of it. And I really love that sound. I think you can hear that most clearly on Hate Songs in the song Tweezers in the middle section, which is just me totally trying to do Andy Gill, sort of attacking the guitar with this trebly strangled sound. But I can't overstate really how big of an influence they were overall. Funny side note, my art teacher at school, Mr. King, he's the brother of John King, the singer of Gang of Four. And of course, as soon as I found that out, he was just inundated with questions constantly about lyrics. And I'm sure he dreaded me going to art class. But he was cool. Thanks, Mr. King. I also really loved Gang of Four, how they sort of took a riff and just repeated it and made it very hypnotic and groovy. And that was definitely a big influence for Hate Songs. The first song, Hate Song, is just basically one riff and you just set up a groove. That was very Gang of Four.
What if you miss?
mentioned earlier, there was a sort of period when I only had 2 records, which was Black Sabbath and Gang of Four. And then at some point, I discovered Bauhaus, and it was a complete game changer. Sort of like Andy Gill from Gang of Four, but I loved the way Daniel Ash played guitar with, all the guitar is really textural. He used feedback and echo as an instrument itself. And it was hugely, hugely influential. Probably the most influential band for me, definitely during my teenage years. And this song, She's in Parties, it's an amazing song. I don't think it's Bauhaus' best song or my favorite song, but I think it's really good to illustrate all the amazing stuff he's doing with guitar in particular. That was a huge influence on my playing. This is just sort of a masterpiece of art noise guitar. I don't even know how he's doing some of these noises. But Bauhaus, I mean, you can hear it really all over Hate songs. On the first song, that feedback build-up is completely stolen from Bauhaus. A lot of the rhythm section stuff, the Hate song version, which is the sort of dubbed out version, Bauhaus did a lot of dub stuff, and, I kind of stole it. 3rd generation at this point, but I loved all the kind of dubby stuff that they did. Taking out a lot of the stuff and just leaving bass and drums, which is really cool. On Boston Baby, all that feedback is totally stolen from Bauhaus. Almost every song, really. They're a huge, huge influence for me.
Special effects by lunatic and drinks. The graveyard scene, the golden years. She's in parties. It's in the can. She's in parties. It's in the can. Oh. Heads under silent wigs. All guys tumble on the cutting room floor. Look like spawn on the cutting room door. She's in the parties. It's in the car. She's in the parties. It's in the car. Lying lies in the rain. Special effects by lunatic and drinks. Freeze frame, screen kiss, hot-head guys. A powder is burnt and beyond the eyes. It's in the car. She's in the parties. It's in the car. Pops in action. Dialogue dub. Now here's the rub. She's acting her reaction. She's in parties. It's in the can. She's in parties. It's in the can. Lying lies in your rain. Special effects by lunatic and drinks. Freeze frame, screen kiss, hot-head guys. A powder is paint and beyond the eyes. She's in parties.
Husker Du was definitely a huge influence for all three of us in the band. Definitely with me, it was that guitar sound, just this sort of raging, fuzzed out guitar sound that's just really intense, and I just loved it. But they also had the songs, and this record, Zen Arcade, is just an absolute masterpiece from start to finish. They cover every single emotion of the human condition, as long as it's negative, within one album. You know, it's a outpouring of futility, frustration, anger, desperation, everything, but with these beautifully crafted pop songs. And if you look at the liner notes of Zen Arcade, it's incredible, because that entire album is a double album, and it was literally recorded in 2 days. So incredibly impressive, and just it's an absolute masterpiece. It really is. It still sounds incredible today. when we started the band, I put an ad in a local record shop in Nottingham, Select a Disc, and the ad simply said, "Big Black Flag, Black Sabbath." So that was the sort of criteria. Obviously, the super aggressive guitar sound I really loved. The sort of the lyrics on Hate Songs were definitely influenced by Big Black as well as some of those other Chicago bands that had just that sort of very dark storytelling. Living in Nottingham at that time, there was definitely no shortage of dark, horrible things going on to sing about. So
yeah, I was the oldest in the band by a good few years, I guess. I have Alex and a few years older than Adrian. I guess we all had similar interests musically. We all kind of liked, punk rock, bit of metal, alternative, that kind of thing. I think metal was probably the first thing I got into when I was a kid. And then, your tastes broaden out a bit. Adrian was probably the biggest influence from that point of view because he had a massive record collection, which me and Alex then rifled through at will whenever we felt like it. I think whenever I do listen to those earlier records, and I haven't listened to them for a long time, but as I remember, the main thing was how fast they were. Because when we first started out, that was kind of a fairly major influence, was the whole hardcore scene. So playing fast was kind of what you did. And it took a while before we worked out that we were a lot happier playing slow, which starts to show itself more when you get to Hate Songs, I suppose. And as it went on, we kind of experimented a bit with playing slower and slower songs. But yeah, we still liked a nice zippy little fast one from time to time as well.
That was Sex Mammoth from the Peel Sessions from Fudge Tunnels in a Word. Then we had I'll Never Forget You from Husker Du, She's in Parties from Bauhaus, Tweezers from Fudge Tunnels Hate Songs in E minor, and then we kicked things off with Gang of Four's What We All Want. So hopefully your people on the other side of this episode are enjoying the sort of interweaving of these influences and things like that. I think, you and I were talking before we started recording and kind of saying, one of the things about Fudge Tunnel is they are very much a band that's like, yeah, I like Fudge Tunnel. They're awesome. And I like their whole album, but they're not like a band built on like singles necessarily. So it would be probably a little bit trickier, I think, to like do it as just a straightforward kind of Fudge Tunnel episode. Like, I think people would either like it if you like Fudge Tunnel or not really be interested at all if you're not really into that sound. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think more of a varied approach to telling the story.
Yeah, I think the songs. This gives a little context that maybe you were a person in the era where you're like, yeah, Fudge Tunnel was not my thing. I liked other earache stuff. But now at least I understand where they're coming from. Like, I never thought of bands like Husker Du and Bauhaus when I heard, Fudge Tunnel, the first time. I just thought they were like Helmet or, Prong.
Yeah.
Or
no,
like
I think it's good to put this kind of context in too, because this stuff is just as important as anything else we listen to, as far as, underground music's concerned. Like the punk stuff and metal stuff are pretty lockstep together, just in a, slightly different place.
Yeah, they're like opposite sides of the tracks, but they were both moving in the same direction. For the most part.
I've always liked hardcore stuff, but I've never known much about like the indie stuff. And it's been 20 years now. But like early 2000s is when I started getting to Slint and some of this other indie rock that I really liked.
Working at the record store and hanging out, and I know you had some professor friends that were kind of influencing you on stuff, and I was feeding you stuff, and it was a very formative period. And I think people that have been with our podcast for a long, long time know that that's why bands like, Catatonia and Paradise Lost are near and dear to us, because they seem to be exploring those same pools at the same time that we were. Mm-hmm. They were like kind of trying to stretch their influences and things. And we were almost of the same age as them, at least Catatonia was probably a little closer to our age, but
and PL maybe like 2 years or 3 years
older.
Say
they're a little bit older than certainly me. So So I want to turn real quick back to the Nick Green's Hall of Fame here. And he kind of asked them, he said the band gained attention from the British press early on for the 2 EPs that Vinyl Solution Pig Boy put out. And he asked, like, how did this shape the material that would become Hate Songs? And David Riley said, I think the main thing that occurred in our songs between the EPs and the album is that we started to slow down. We'd kind of gotten hardcore out of our system. We'd always wrote quite slowly, but we rehearsed at least once a week, and something new usually bubbled up. But then it would usually take a long time before it became a song. I guess Boston Baby and Bed Crumbs. I always want to say breadcrumbs.
Slint.
Yeah, exactly. Were early ones because they're part of the first Peel session. All right. And we just heard Sex Mammoth from the Peel session there. And we're going to hear Boston Baby from the Peel session in the next set that he's kind of talking about here. The writing process was pretty collaborative, as I remember, although Alex usually came up with most of the actual riffs. I was still writing some of the lyrics at this point, but I didn't really do any after Hate Songs in E minor, as Alex felt more comfortable singing his own words. Alex goes on and says the material on the EPs was that bridge from the early sound where we were trying to do Dinosaur Jr. I felt like these EPs were not fully realized, but you could see what we were trying to do. When we started on Hate Songs, we felt like we knew what would always work and what wouldn't. Fudge Tunnel almost always worked as a 3-piece writing unit. It was very rare that any one of us would bring an entire song in. It often started with one of us bringing in a part of a chorus. It was definitely a group effort. I seem to remember it going pretty quickly and easily. And
well, it's good to hear, because I forgot that part of it, because it definitely sounds like it's, written as a core group and not just a single person.
Yep, absolutely. And then Parkin, which I think is Adrian. I always forget his first name. He says, if you listen to Sex Mammoth, you can hear elements of what we were later on. My style of playing and Dave's style never really changed. We just got a little more technically proficient. Moving to the second EP, we still had no idea what we were doing in the studio. We worked with Ian Burgess and were a bit starstruck because he had recorded Big Black and Naked Ray Gun and bands like that. He was a great guy, but he wasn't a great producer. He didn't push us that hard. He just recorded what we put down. The sound of the second EP is a bit heavier than the first one, but not all that different. There was a much bigger sea change between the second EP and the sound of Hate Songs. It's harder to put a finger on what changed, but we were going after something heavier, and we found the right producer with Colin Richardson. That's what gave Fudge Tunnel a sound, really. And we'll talk more about Colin a little bit later. But yeah, so I think some good insight kind of into what was kind of going on with the band there. I guess Colin Richardson, we could kind of maybe bring him up now. When I say Colin Richardson, what's the first thing you think of, Mark? Because I know what it is for me.
Well, Carcass and Bolt Thrower.
Yeah, I mean that's such a building block of like my kind of my gateway drugs. Is certainly into British kind of extreme music and firmly European kind of music. Mm-hmm. I mean, I thought of his name in the way that I thought of like Fleming Rasmussen, like being part of those Metallica records and stuff. Like, his name being on something was like, oh shit, it was like Scott Burns for Florida and some of that sort of stuff.
And when I think about, not when I listen to it necessarily, but when I think about the tone of Hate Songs, I think of Steve Albini.
Oh, yeah.
And there's some elements there, but this is definitely a Colin Richardson.
Yep.
Everything's like right in the center of your head kind of thing, but also every instrument sounds great, and it's mixed just very densely, but there's still, that's what, I think why Heartwork sounds so good as well, as there's all this stuff going on, but there's still like room to breathe throughout the whole thing. It's not this like completely constricted entity.
Yeah. It's dense and chunky, mm-hmm. but like airy at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you kind of nailed it there. And it's interesting you mentioned kind of the Steve Albini thing, because obviously, right after Sex Mammoth, we just kind of heard him talking about the influence that Big Black had on his thinking as a writer and the sound and stuff like that. So, like I said, I think the Chicago, Minneapolis stuff is very much there too.
Yeah, like the live, it sounds like a live drum kit, like played in a live room. It doesn't sound like, like some stuff now where everything sounds completely isolated and, triggered sounds. It sounded like you could hear room noise and stuff too.
Well, and it makes sense because these guys were such huge fans of like, Slint and stuff like that too, mm-hmm. which of course Albini's kind of linked to. And it's funny. we've heard Albert's kind of submission. We're waiting on Nick's as we record this. So I don't know if he'll talk about this in his little thing, but Nick and I were kind of texting last week, talking a little bit about Fudge Tunnel. And he said, yeah, he goes, when you talk to Alex, sometimes like he's real leery. Like one of the things he warned me of, he goes, the fact that your podcast is called Requiem Metal Podcast, that might be like a red flag for him. Like he doesn't want anything to do with metal. And sure enough, Alex definitely said like, I'm not really into metal. And I was like, oh, well, we do other stuff. And Nick said like the thing that I think kind of got Alex to convince him to do the Decibel Hall of Fame is he kind of struck up a conversation about how much they love Slint. And all of a sudden he kind of had him on the hook. And it's a bummer because I think I sent a Slint episode that we did to Alex, but he might not have like looked that far into the email, into some of the links that I kind of sent along with it. But I was hoping that might be the bridge.
Thought about when we first put it out, we could just call it the Requiem Podcast.
Requiem Podcast, yeah.
But at this point, you got to double down on.
I know, so we could shorten it when we need to. Maybe in emails to like people like Alex in the future, I'll just call it the Requiem Podcast. But
yeah.
But yeah, so the Sex Mammoth EP, strangely enough, actually had like kind of some weird success. It shot up the British charts, and it actually became the Enemy's single of the week. And Enemy was like a pretty big, British kind of magazine, kind of a tastemaker and stuff.
Yeah, it was a weekly, almost like a kind of like a college rock kind of thing. I don't know if he had really an equivalent here. I remember picking up every once in a while, like if Napalm was on the cover, because it was always at like Tower Records, and sometimes they would have it at what's that? The place that was in Mount Pleasant that was a chain.
Oh, Warehouse Records.
Records. They'd have it, and it was most of the time it was like stuff I didn't give a shit about. I was like, oh shit, Napalm Death's on there. It's like, okay, I'll grab it.
Yeah, because I remember when I was working at the record, or not the record station, the radio station. They were obviously like the college charts, and the college charts were like a lot more eclectic, and I feel like that's kind of what like Enemy was, sort of in a way.
Yeah, totally.
Alex,
I mean that used to be like the tastemaker of what.
Yeah.
What like new music was.
The Hot 100.
Like new music something
like that, or the
New
Hot
Musical Express is what Enemy stands for.
Yeah, New Musical Express. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So Alex has a quote here, and this is from one of the Kerrang interviews or someplace I found it, but I wrote it down. He says, initially we saw our only purpose as pissing people off, which we did quite well. The whole thing was new and strange to us, as none of us had really been in bands before. But the UK music scene is ruled by the press, a lot more so than the US. So we had a single of the week, but we had sold maybe 5 or 10 copies of the record. so it's all kind of like myth. You know what I mean? It's almost kind of like they're almost like predicting something that kind of hasn't happened, and they all want to be like cutting edge, like Enemy and stuff like that. So they would often like kind of take these like leaps of faith and stuff like that. So
well, I think it was they're talking about Creep Diets, one of the interviews I was listening to on YouTube, and that sold like, at least at the time in the 90s, it sold 60,000 copies. And
okay,
that would get you on the Billboard charts easy now.
Oh, without doubt,
that's huge. But
it might put you in like the top 20.
Yeah, like back then, that was like your borderline getting kicked off the label.
Oh yeah, you were fucking dog shit. Sold 60,000 copies.
And like now, thinking of a death metal band, selling that, or it's just nuts.
Yep. Yeah. The perspective on that has kind of changed.
The way the Billboard chart has changed so much now, it's like, it's not that big a deal. You're on the Billboard chart.
Mm-hmm. And so the story of kind of where we turn the corner towards hate songs comes from the Hall of Fame with Nick. And he kind of asks him, how did Fudge Tunnel end up signing with Earache? And Alex says, the first 2 EPs were on Pig Boy Records, which was run by Rob Tennant in London. We absolutely loved him, but it was a very small label with limited resources. With the recordings, we realized that we had not achieved the sound that we wanted. Earache had the money to get us a producer and a nicer studio. We did not feel any kinship with any of the bands on Earache, and we were upfront about that. The one band that I felt some connection to was Godflesh. They were coming from this industrial noise place that was maybe closer to what we were doing. The label head, Digby Pearson, explained that they were trying to expand the sound of Earache, and he wanted to sign Clutch and John Zorn. This is also when they started putting out aggressive house music records. It seemed like he listened to different kinds of music, so it was a hopeful situation. Riley goes on to say, Earache were local to us, and we knew a couple of the people who worked there. Johnny Jabs Barry from the band Filler, who we'd done shows with, and Martin Nesbitt, who was a DJ at the Garage, a cool club in Nottingham back in the day. They were good people, and Earache made us an offer which would allow us to make an album the way we want it to. Unfortunately, on the eve of our album's release, we heard that Martin had been sacked from Earache for being too friendly with the bands. Things went downhill from here. However, Martin quickly became our manager, and Jabs later became our booking agent. As for kinship with the other bands, I never really felt like we fit on Earache with all the grindcore malarkey and dodgy American death metal. But they did have some more experimental stuff in the pipeline, and I really liked Godflesh a lot. So that's pretty cool. And then Parkin says, in many ways, it was laziness.
That's the one I remember the most.
Earache was the path of least resistance. We wanted to put a record out, and Earache was ready with a recording budget. We all thought, hey, great idea. In hindsight, not the best idea. We weren't treated particularly well. We weren't promoted. I don't think they knew what to do with us because we weren't Napalm Death. We didn't have immediate appeal for metal fans. Jabs and Martin were nice, but we never quite hit it off with Dig. Our relationship with him was always a bit adversarial, and the way we all look back on this time is probably colored by that. We did get 3 great albums out of the deal, so it's hard to say whether that would have been on a better label for us at the same time. So that's kind of how they got on Earache, but does seem like kind of a strange fit. But I do kind of remember when Earache and some of those labels were kind of spread their wings a little bit, and that was the thing I appreciate about Earache. That was like a label where you could almost buy it just because it was on Earache in that era, because you knew that there was a quality to it. It was like 4AD or something like that. It just had or War Records,
or Peaceful or something. You just always something interesting there.
Whereas Relapse or Nuclear Blast, you had to be a little more selective, but for the most part, you were going to get probably quality, but not
Nuclear Blast was more of they're pretty much a straight death metal label.
Yeah, they didn't have a lot of diversity in that.
There's some doom. It was all extreme metal stuff for the most part.
Yeah.
Now they're a little. They got Slayer for their last record, which is kind of a good get.
Yeah.
But it's always been kind of that extreme. I think it's the only one of those that still hasn't been sold to a conglomerate. Yeah,
because Relapse and Century Media, they've all been bought out.
Yeah, they're both on Sony, and then what do you call it? I think Roadrunner's owned by Elektra. Warner Brothers Music.
Who bought Earache? Did anybody buy Earache?
No, Earache's still their own thing.
Okay.
But they're not really
they're just not that good
for modern. They don't have that many modern bands that are actually they're living off of their
reissues, basically.
Their back catalog.
Yep. So, own your masters. That's the key, right? That's the advice that I hear a lot in these when I study the history of rock and roll. That's the advice people the first people that started to know how to own your masters were the ones that kind of took over the industry.
And you don't sign a contract where they own it in perpetuity.
Mm-hmm.
No, you can press it for X amount of years and then it reverts back to you, not 50 years or something. These are just stupid contracts, but when you're young, you don't know any of this stuff.
Immediate gratification. Yep.
Yeah.
So, yep. Well, so let's look back kind of at the foundations of Fudge Tunnel and Hate Sounds. That's kind of where we want to get back into here. This is kind of really the last set where we're going to be doing kind of a half Fudge Tunnel, half other stuff. And we'll sprinkle a couple other influences throughout the rest of the episodes. But this is kind of where we start to turn more into the total Fudge Tunnel sort of direction. And we're going to start with Dinosaur Jr., Sludgefeast. And I always want to say Sludge Fest, but it's Sludgefeast. And we already talked a little bit about how important You're Living All Over Me was. The guys said that in their interview with Nick Green. And Alex will talk a little bit about it at the beginning of this set too. And, this is perhaps, like I said, the biggest influence on early Fudge Tunnel, especially according to Nick Green. And
just you can minus the solos.
Yeah, I was going to say the only thing is definitely the solos. But even then, the noisiness of the solos and what Jay Mascis was kind of doing with his kind of sonic kind of bombast was there. They're just a lot sloppier,
Well, and vocally they're much different too. But Mascis has this weird slacker. I don't even know how to really describe his voice.
Yeah, that's nasally kind of slacker kind of thing.
It's borderline the warble.
Yeah, it's a little bit. I mean, they definitely.
But it's not like Creed. You know, it's its own thing.
No, not at all. And I think like you can kind of hear some of that slacker attitude in kind of Alex's no care kind of persona, if not not necessarily the way he sings, but definitely kind of that like disaffected kind of rock star. He's not really wanting to be any of that stuff. Mm-hmm. I think what's interesting in this tune is that sequence around the 4-minute mark where it like kind of goes from this like pure noise and then fades into like a kind of catchy riff and a solo. And that's like, yeah, you don't hear solos in Fudge Tunnel, but the idea of going from like a kind of wall of noise into like kind of a catchy riff is definitely something you hear, especially even in the next song, you know, Boston Baby, which we're gonna hear the Peel Session version from 1990, but there is also a version on Hate Songs in E minor that it's catchy, you know, and you can hear kind of the spirit of Dinosaur Jr. in a song like Boston Baby. And I think it's also interesting too. And I think it's probably totally like a happy accident. You know, Dinosaur Jr. hail from Amherst, Massachusetts. And then you've got the song Boston Baby. That's like the most Dinosaur Jr. of it. It's this like kind of kindred spirit. That's cool. I love the kind of Boston Mass kind of connection there, you know? Yeah. And especially at the end of Boston Baby, you hear that like noisy sort of burst that is going to become more synonymous when they get to Hate Songs, you know. Mm-hmm. And, that's something they're definitely stealing, not just from Dinosaur Jr., but definitely one of the big influences there. Then we go to a band that I love, and I don't know if you're really familiar with them. There's a band, I think Ben Bracken kind of got me into Loop. I don't know if did you ever check out?
I had a couple records, yeah.
Did you? Okay. I didn't know if they were a band you kind of knew when we were putting this together, but probably never in my wildest dreams did I think we'd be playing Loop on Requiem. So I'm kind of pumped. I love they've got a real psychedelic kind of trance-like kind of space rock. People kind of referred to them as sometimes. I had Gilded Eternity, which we're going to hear a tune from here, The Nail Will Burn. And I also had Fade Out back in college. I always like kind of dug like the sort of layered sonic, kind of almost like krautrock kind of like qualities.
Yeah, but they have the similar bass sensibility with that. Yeah, that's kind of like that propulsive bass thing.
And I feel like post-punk borrows a lot from like the Can kind of bass kind of style a little bit. But I think what I liked about Loop is it's like they had the Can krautrock kind of aspect, but it was like tinged with a lot of like Stooges sloppy mess on top of it, you know? And
it made it less glossy and kind of, I think it made it more interesting to me.
And I think like you can draw a line from Loop, and we already mentioned this band earlier, into like your Smashing Pumpkins, because I think that's like the kind of band that like Loop was inspiring too. They were inspiring Fudge Tunnel, but also like your almost like shoegaze indie stuff that was like heavier, you know? Yeah. Definitely like My Bloody Valentine had its heavy moments, but they're sometimes more cerebral in certain ways. This is still like in the kind of rock punk kind of like, it's got that, that's still that drive that sometimes like My Bloody Valentine kind of was almost too abstract by the time you get to Loveless, you gotta kind of like dive through the sea to find the song within it. And it's there are melodies and stuff, but they're kind of buried sometimes. But so that's kind of cool. So we'll listen to Loop, and Alex will talk a little bit about Loop. And then we get to a band that, for some strange reason, even though we've talked about it, we still haven't done an episode on, and it's probably a long time coming, sometime soon. But Ministry. I
looked at their discography today. Holy shit!
Yeah, it's a lot.
Have you seen how long that is?
Well,
I really only want to talk about maybe like 4 records.
Yeah, I mean, I've recently picked up like Twitch and things like that, and I kind of dig that stuff more now.
I think like most of the modern stuff I don't really care about. Anything after.
I can go up to Filth Pig. I could talk about that record a bit.
I haven't really given that much of a listen after, because like Psalm 69 was so kind of transformative that I didn't think anybody could do anything after that.
And honestly,
part 2, like, okay.
Filth Pig was kind of a letdown at times, although there were like some cool moments. But there was also a 3-year gap too, and a lot changed.
They toured that record for fucking ever, for 3 years.
Well, think about how much the landscape of alternative indie heavy music changed between 92 and 95. I mean, that's like eternity, in that era. Yeah. Things were moving so quickly. And I think by the time Filth Pig came out, like, I don't know, I was into into like Carcass, and I was like, okay, you know, like
Yeah, like
it wasn't.
it seemed kind of like old hat.
Yeah, I was like, okay, I like that trio of heavy Ministry records from Land and Mind and Solemn, and I didn't really, I don't know, I didn't give Phil Pig a fair shake, but I've gone back in like recent years, and I'm like, oh, there's some stuff that they were doing that was pretty cool, you know.
Yeah, I mean, they have some, but they seemed like everything after Psalm 69 seems to be some type of kind of derivative.
Yeah,
like that's where they ended their like really big,
yep.
you know, kind of experimentation. Like, okay, they found their formula and they kind of stick with it.
I guess I'd be curious if any of our Requiem fans, like if you guys have followed Ministry, is there like a comeback record that like is actually like really inspired? Because I probably don't have the patience to sift through all of that post stuff, if I'm being honest. But if there's one that's particularly like inspired and badass that we should check out, like feel free to
let us know. I know I got you know, a PR inquiry about the new one that had like a, you know, Jello Biafra.
Yeah.
You know, thing. It's fine. Like when we saw them live, they definitely played some stuff that, you know, we didn't know.
It was newer. Yep.
It was fine, but it's still, it's just kind of like derivative of that album.
Yeah. Those albums are so warm and fuzzy that it's going to be hard to convince me otherwise, you know?
Yeah. And just I don't know, the kind of like vision. If you ever had like that, what the fuck was that thing called? It came out when Mine's a Terrible Thing to Taste did, but it was the live.
Oh, the live! I love that live
video.
Yeah,
there's a VHS of it where they're like inside of a cage, like, you know, fucking Blues Brothers getting bottles thrown on them and shit. And it's like the most. It seems like the craziest show ever when I saw it as a kid. I was like, man, these guys got to be insane. Well, I saw him a couple times after that, and it was still, you know, he drank a fifth of Jack Daniels during the show. And then starts another one. It's like, Jesus Christ, man, this guy's out of his mind. And you find out he's on heroin, and like, how do you even perform?
I don't know, honestly. And
but
then
they were incredible shows, you know, 2 drummers, and like it was just a whole fucking thing.
And I remember the rumor. I think we brought this up in like an old episode sometime when it came up. But like the rumors of like the guy that was at Ministry shows following them around that was like drilling people. And,
taking a drill and getting them in the head or something, and
or like drilling them in the back, so like you feel it and be like, what the fuck, you know, like you didn't know where it was coming from. I mean, that's like some like truly twisted, like, I mean, there was an edge to industrial stuff that was like S&M and creepy, and like I couldn't really wrap my head around it as like a 14-year-old, but I knew like when I watched like 9 Inch Nails Wish, the video, I was like, this is like uncomfortable. Like I don't think I knew like the total aesthetic yet of kind of dystopian stuff or you know, like I didn't understand all of the references and things like that. It doesn't scare me now. I'm interested in stuff like that a lot more, but like I was scared of like 9 Inch Nails stuff because I couldn't figure it out, you know.
Well, the Ministry stuff I don't know if 9 Inch Nails didn't seem as drug fueled.
No,
Ministry seemed so drug fueled that I had no frame of reference outside of like, you know, Hunter S. Thompson or something, but it didn't. But it was like way beyond that. I mean, it wasn't like intellectualized. It was like just like this pure energy.
How do you watch a video like Just One Fix and not like get disturbed as like I was 13 when I saw that and was like, what the fuck? Like this guy's like
scared to see the band. Yeah.
I was like, Jesus Christ, they're showing like it's a music video where a dude's like ODing the whole time. And I was like, what the fuck? You know, like, I don't know.
And some of it's probably theater. Like,
for sure.
Know, I'm sure he's not, you know, he's not doing shows every night and drinking a fifth of booze. Like, but I mean, he certainly could have. He's in his 20s, you know, 30s, you know, doing a bunch of speed shit. You could probably make it through, but it was just, the whole idea was just like I'd never saw another band that was like that.
And I'll be honest, I think Psalm 69 has a more visceral effect over me than like the first time I heard like a Deicide record. And I know that too. Yeah, I think Deicide was supposed to scare me, and certainly the song titles caught me off guard. I was like, should I be listening to Satan Spawn the Keiko Demon and shit like that? But like hearing Psalm 69 and hearing like the samples of like the preacher and like him screaming, drinking the blood of Jesus, drinking it right. Like, I didn't understand, you know, the sort of Catholic mythology. Like I was taking that sort of literally. And like, I didn't understand all of that because I wasn't raised Catholic. And So it was like I was trying to piece together what the fuck was going on, and you know, then you had like NWO with a weird fucking samples, and it sounded like the Apocalypse, and
Yeah.
that was like disturbing, you know, because I was starting to watch movies like Terminator and Terminator 2, and I was like, oh, like, what does all this mean? You know, I don't think I was scared of like Glenn Benton, you know, that much.
No, I thought he was laughable, to be honest.
Yeah.
I thought it was like crazy that some idiot burned a cross in his head.
Yeah, it was hard for me to take that seriously.
But outside of that, like, it wasn't, there's nothing else in the music that was any scarier than anything Entombed was doing.
Yeah.
Or anything
absolutely.
really. But,
So I think it was inevitable in doing a Fudge Tunnel show, doing the backstory, that we were either going to have to play a Godflesh song or a Ministry song. And so
Totally.
I figured, why not Ministry? You know, so we've definitely played Godflesh before. So, you know, Destruction, a tune from Land of Rape and Honey. This is not a song I'm like as familiar with. I think I always listen to like the front half more, like Stigmata and things like that. But this is cool. This has like more of the old Ministry, like the Twitch kind of era in it a little, which I actually believe probably would be more influential on Alex, just based on like his love of post-punk stuff and some of that, you know, and Bauhaus.
It definitely has that more post-punk sensibility for sure.
Yeah. But, you know, in a lot of ways, like Ministry was similar, like, you know, Fudge Tunnel, impossibly heavy, impossibly confrontational, yet completely separate from the metal and the mainstream alternative scenes. They didn't fit into any of that either, you know, and so they're kind of like kindred spirits in that sort of way. And you can certainly hear that approach of like the kind of industrialized, kind of shoegazy sort of main riff in the song we're going to end this set with from Fudge Tunnel, which is Kitchen Belt. You know, like that riff in the opening sounds just like Smashing Pumpkins, like, you know, Siva or Geek USA or Silverfuck or Bury Me, like those early kind of Smashing Pumpkins, kind of like more sonic tunes.
It sounds like soundtracks to like a 90s skateboard video.
Yeah.
Completely. This is the one that has the 302-101 as the only lyrics I really understood.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, I've never picked up on that. So, yeah. So, I mean, you know, and then it's interesting because it then switches from that kind of more shoegazy Smashing Pumpkins riff into more of a kind of Godflesh Ministry sort of filthy thing with the kind of rhythmic bounce that's kind of in there, you know,
bringing back the brutality bounce.
Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting is this song, and I think a song we're going to play not in this set, but in the next set, even has like a little bit of vibes of some like kind of crossover sort of thrash riffs. But they're kind of buried in all the other stuff. And again, I don't think like, you know, these guys were thrash fans. They might have been crossover fans. They might have dug some of like, you know, some DRI or some Suicidal at times. But
well, they definitely have some palm muting happening here and there. So.
Yeah, so it's definitely in there. So I think like kind of after, you know, the Kitchen Belt will be sort of the sort of send off for us to really kind of do our deep dive into hate songs when we kind of come back. So we're going to hear Sludgefeast from Dinosaur Jr., then Boston Baby from the 1990 Peel Sessions from Fudge Tunnel, and then Nail Will Burn from Loop, Destruction from Ministry, and then we're going to end with a tune from Hate Songs called Kitchen Belt, and then we'll hear from Alex all throughout all of this and come back and really unpack this record.
I think if I could pick one record that was just the big influence for hate songs, it would be this one, You're Living All Over Me. You know, it's the sort of layers and layers of massively distorted guitar noise that's all over hate songs was directly me listening to nothing but this album for just months on end. And this song is a great example because they have everything. They have the sort of stripped down verses, the more aggressive guitar noise stuff. And then they even have the little Easter egg at the end of the song where they rip into this sort of hardcore part with a guitar solo. I was never really good enough to sort of do those solos like Jay does, and I think I didn't really want to anyway, but I did really love these just sort of layers of like massively distorted guitars. It's just so much fun. And we all went down to see Dinosaur Jr. about that time. It was probably 88, 89 in Leeds. And they came on, they had a reel-to-reel tape player at the side of the stage. And they just walked on, they pressed play on this reel-to-reel, and on this tape was just nothing but just like horrendous overloaded guitar noise, just layers of guitar noise. And it was loud, and I mean loud. I've seen some loud concerts, but this was fucking loud. And they started playing the set. You could barely hear the song, but, you know, beneath them playing over this tape loops of noise. The tape played in between every song and through every song. And then they finally finished their set and it was still playing. And then they finally just went over and pressed stop, and that was the end of their set. So it's like 38 minutes or whatever of layers of massive, horrendous guitar noise. And it was absolutely beautiful. On Hate Songs, you can hear the Dinosaur influence, like the end of Boston Baby, where the guitars just get all crazy and layered and distorted. The end of Sunshine of Your Love, just the ridiculous guitar overload was definitely Dinosaur Jr. style.
Well, it's tricky to be honest, because it's one of those, I've heard that record a lot. Obviously, I helped write it and played on it, so you hear the record an awful lot when you're doing that, and you hear the songs and you hear every drum beat, and you kind of lose perspective on it a bit, I think. As far as legacy, I don't know. That's for other people to say, really. I don't know if we influenced anybody or not. We probably did, but hopefully the people we influenced went on to make good music. Favourite songs? I don't know. I was kind of like Boston Baby. We always played that one live because it was fun to play live. It's quite an easy song to play, and you can kind of chuck yourself around to it. So yeah, Boston Baby probably, and also I always really liked Soap and Water as well, which we didn't tend to play live nearly as much. But it was the way the vocals were treated that I particularly liked, because when we were in the studio, I think we were mixing it in Sheffield maybe, and the engineer there, along with Alex, came up with the idea to treat the vocals with, I think it was like backwards reverb or something, as well as each line kind of whooshes in. And I was always pretty chuffed with that. I mean, nothing to do with me, but yeah, I always liked that one.
Loop was definitely a huge influence on Fudge Tunnel, both the first record, Heaven's End, and Gilded Eternity. I just loved how, well, the band's called Loop, so they basically take a riff that's awesome and just play it over and over. It's sort of like Gang of Four, it's like that hypnotic groove that they get into. Any similarities between Loop's fuzzed out guitar sound and Hate Songs is purely deliberate. Also, that sort of thing of mixing the vocals quite low and having them be textural, definitely another thing from Loop. So brilliant band. At some point in probably 92, we were fortunate enough to have John, the drummer of Loop, was our live sound engineer, and brilliant chap and excellent all-round musician. I know all three of us in the band really loved Ministry. And I think on this track, the thing that I think is most influential is probably all those vocal effects. You know, the kind of echoing in the background, some guy screaming from the back of a room, vocal effects. And that's definitely all over Hate Songs. I think the Hate Song version is where it's probably most obvious. But also the sampling thing, the sampling of the guitar on Hate Song version, which was definitely trying to sort of do a Depeche Mode thing, but also definitely sort of getting into that sampling industrial sort of vibe that Ministry were doing. love the Dead Kennedys and the ridiculous over-the-top guitar tone, the sort of surf guitar from hell. Their whole sound just made them really stand out to me over a lot of punk bands that sounded very samey. They definitely have their own style. Obviously, Jello's lyrics, just incredible, just like really witty and biting and smart, but in a way that's not preachy. He's just really great at making fun of everybody and just making it sound really cool. The artwork inside Hate Songs, when you open it up, you fold it out and there's a sort of poster, collage poster of basically all this fucked up shit, was definitely a bit of a tribute to the Dead Kennedys' Fresh Fruit album. In fact, it's very, very similar indeed. Didjits were from Chicago, late 80s, and just this like super high energy rock and roll band. An amazing live band. On the back of Hate Songs, where the text sort of just goes straight across and there's no break and it's just one massive block. If you care to look at the back of the album of Hey Jews, well, it's sort of a similar thing. So they influenced not just the songwriting, but the artwork as well.
That was Kitchen Belt from Fudge Tunnel, Destruction from Ministry, Nail Will Burn from Loop, Boston Baby from Fudge Tunnel, and then we kicked things off with Sludgefeast from Dinosaur Jr. And you heard there at the end, Alex kind of talking a little bit about the influence of some more kind of punk stuff, Dead Kennedys and Didjits. But in particular, one of the reasons I threw those in is because they start talking about the visual influence on like how Fudge Tunnel did the artwork and some of the layouts and things like that. And this is a good time to kind of really start to unpack Hate Songs, because Hate Songs had some problems that they got into with the artwork.
With the Nottingham Vice Squad.
Yeah. Pretty kind of interesting stuff.
That was the T-shirt that was in I think it was Albert's T-shirt that was.
It is Albert's T-shirt, yeah.
With the guy getting his head cut off with a pair of scissors.
Yep. And Alex, kind of talks about the cover and the layout, at the end there. And the cover, like you said it got them in trouble with the Nottingham Vice Squad. They make a raid on Earache's offices, essentially. And he discussed this with Nick a little bit. So I thought I'd kind of share some of the highlights. And David Riley says the police raided the Earache office because of some artwork on the Painkiller EP, Guts of a Virgin. And for people that don't know Painkiller, that was a John Zorn kind of project. Was Justin Broderick involved with Painkiller?
I don't remember.
I know somebody else was from the extreme metal world, and I can't remember who it was. Because there's also, what's the side project that had Ian Mackay and other guys that was kind of industrially.
Ian Mackay was on a Earache thing?
I don't know if it was Earache, but it was like kind of in that same era. There was like a weird side project that, like, I don't know. I'll have to look that up. But yeah, I forgot to look at it. But I remember Tim O'Brien always used to talk about Painkiller. And then I was into John Zorn, and I know you were too. And so I kind of knew about them peripherally. Mm-hmm. Because of like Naked City and some of the other John Zorn kind of stuff that was going on.
Yeah. And Napalm never talked about him too.
Yeah. For people that don't know John Zorn, he was a Jewish jazz musician who was also kind of into extreme stuff. Kind of like a Mike Patton type figure, in that he kind of was always doing like art experimental things, and some of it was interesting and some of it was just kind of noise. But in particular, Naked City, if you want like aggressive, like fierce, like insane jazz that's also strangely listenable, Naked City is a good place to start with. I don't know about
and then he went on to do stuff with Lombardo too.
Yeah, for sure. They kind of hooked up, and then even like the John Zorn Masada stuff is like really amazing jazz kind of records that have like kind of a Jewish tinge to them in some ways. But yeah, anyway, so Painkiller, that's the album that kind of started this whole descent, according to David Riley. And he says they grabbed anything they could find that they thought might be a bit dodgy. The original art for Hate Songs in E minor was an illustration from a series of books called How to Kill. The author was an ex-CIA agent named John Minery, who was probably very disturbed. The text was accompanied by some very basic, almost childlike diagrams, and we chose one illustrating how to decapitate someone. The replacement art for the album worked out well, though. We all got to see Alex's nipple. So there you go.
Actually do. I prefer the replacement artwork as far as
I think so too.
It's like abstract, and you don't really
Yeah. Yeah, it's something like I think people like you and I are more drawn to. I think there's kind of a literalness to the other artwork that I think wouldn't age well. You know,
it's just kind of, it seems very kind of juvenile.
yeah. I
Like,
get the shock value.
I get what they're trying to do. It's like, it's ridiculous that something so serious is drawn so childish too, you know. Like, you know, the CIA guy would describe this in stick figures.
Yep.
But I think the other one works better aesthetically. Like, given the name and everything else, like that's more of kind of like a classic, you know, noise rock cover as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. It's something you would see in AMRAP for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. And then Alex kind of goes on a little bit later and he says, yeah, John Zorn wanted to have an image of his album cover that was as shocking as the music. He decided to fly from New York to the UK to hand deliver the artwork. Of course, when he landed at Heathrow, they found the photo. They investigated him, discovered he was associated with earache, so the Vice Squad staged a raid on the earache office. Our artwork was on a desk that Johnny was using to lay it out. At the time, we were quite frustrated. The original artwork from Hate Songs was a stick drawing of a violent act. It's a stretch to call it offensive. It was silly. We didn't have much time to replace it, so we picked a blurred live shot to throw in the frame. I don't agree with censorship of that nature, and I don't think that what happened was a good thing from, hang on, I got to flip the page here, from that perspective. But looking back on it now, I'm sort of relieved with how it worked out. I'm not sure I'd feel comfortable with having an album cover depicting a violent act with the way that the world has become now. So some good perspective, I think, from him there. You know?
Yeah, I think Carcass got Symphonies.
Is that when Symphonies got in trouble?
Or maybe this was a different time, but like the Vice Squad hit a couple times.
Yeah, jeez. And then you also had the Nuclear Blast thing with Dismember, right?
Yeah, Skinner Alive single.
Yep. So that was getting rated and stuff. And then you had Mark's mom with the Pieces EP.
What is that? Yeah, that was the one. Like, what is this stuff?
That was the deal breaker. Yeah.
Well, no, after that she never questioned me.
Not
again.
the deal breaker, but that was the one where like she had the I call it the talk, because I had the talk once.
Yeah.
And I don't know what album prompted my mom to have the talk. I don't know if it was, I think it was the collective whole of everything. It was just like the totality of what was kind of going on in my bedroom. And she was like, is this something I need to be concerned with? And I was like, no, it's Halloween. And she's like, okay.
Yeah, it's like, none of this is serious. Good. It's just like,
you
know, it's like me watching Friday the 13th movies. I don't go out and kill people after, you know, it's like it's a release.
Yeah. That's good. And so then the album was actually recorded at Sawmills Studio in Cornwall and then Frontier Studios in Nottingham with Colin Richardson. And Alex talked a little bit about the impact that Colin had in that.
The drums were recorded at that first studio, correct? I
think so. Yep. Okay. I think that's how it was kind of separated. And it was actually mixed at Axis Studios in Sheffield too. I didn't kind of throw that in, but yeah, Alex says Colin Richardson was absolutely instrumental in shaping the sound of the album. Our frames of reference musically were not always things that Colin knew about, but he was open to that input. Colin's style is straight and clean sounding, very clean. I was always asking if we could make things dirtier or uglier. I'd play him some Killing joke and he'd be like, oh, you want distorted vocals? And then he'd crank the channels on the boards. And I knew what I was looking for, but I didn't have the words or the technique to express it. There's a lot of reverb on the drums on Hate Songs. The reason that came about is that I said I want it to sound like Junkyard by the Birthday Party, Nick Cave band for people that don't know who Birthday Party is.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, speaking of Nick Cave, holy fucking shit. He just lost a second kid.
Yeah.
Like yesterday or 2 days ago. I was so like heartbroken by it. I was like, dude, I just can't. Like,
does he have any kids left?
I don't know, but I know like he wrote that whole album about his one son dying a couple of years back, and
it wasn't like an Eric Clapton thing, was it?
I don't think so. I don't know the details. I'll be honest. I probably should have looked, but I was just like, fuck, just stay away from that. So
I don't have any kids.
Terrible. So anyways, back to the drum sound. He wanted to sound like Birthday Party. Colin wasn't familiar, so I played him the record, and he was like, you want it to sound like this? That was Colin's attempt to get that very ambient sound from the drums, which wasn't something he would have necessarily gone for. Colin brought a lot of his own ideas into the sessions as well, which I appreciated. I learned 90% of what I do these days from that experience. So that's pretty cool.
He said in another interview, he said he kind of took, that's when that record, he kind of took him under his wing, and you know, he showed interest, and Richardson kind of just showed him the ropes.
Sure. Yeah. And you know, that you were bringing up the lyrics before, and they kind of talk about kind of the lyrics, you know, the thing that's in the inside, the none of these lyrics mean anything, so don't waste your time, I guess. Yeah. And Nick and Alex both kind of talk a little bit about that in Decibel. Newport says, I sometimes have people email me and ask me if they can have the lyrics. I'll listen to the songs and try to type it out for them, only to realize that I'm not really sure what I was singing on certain songs. One of the things that we wrote about a lot was the squalor and unpleasant situations that surrounded people who grew up in the Midlands in the UK in the late 80s. For me, it was more interesting to write from someone else's perspective. This caused some issues because some people would assume that I was writing about my own life. They were confused by that. It got to the point where we definitely tried to steer people's attention away from the lyrics because we didn't feel like they were that integral to appreciating the music. That's how that joke came about. And then, like I said, Nick kind of talks about it a little bit more too. Wait, Nick. Oh yeah, that's the part I want to read. Nick is in Nick Green. Sorry. So yeah, so you know, you've got an interesting sort of approach aesthetically. You've got interesting approach kind of lyrically, and you know, the initial sort of vinyl pressings of the album actually came with a bonus 7-inch where they did the Cat Scratch Fever, and which was basically them fucking around and Colin playing a purposely shitty solo in the studio, and then another tune called Joined at the Dick, and neither of those were actually intended for the record. And so like in the later reissues that have been put out there, like he's still kind of pissed. He's like, I don't like that album ends with Cat Scratch Fever. It was never really supposed to be on there. So it's like, it's a bonus track kind of, but he wanted the album to sort of end with kind of the noisiness of the Cream cover. That's kind of like how they envisioned it.
Yeah.
So kind of a, you know, I get that, you know, when you want like everything to kind of fit together in the sort of right way, you know. Well, let's kind of start to unpack this stuff a little bit in this next set. This is going to be kind of the main set, I guess. We've heard some hate songs kind of sprinkled out throughout the episode, but this is going to be very much the hate songs kind of focused set. And it's going to begin with Alex kind of talking about two bands that are kind of near and dear to Mark and I, Joy Division and Sisters of Mercy. And we finally did it, Mark. We finally got a reason to play a Sisters of Mercy song for you. We snuck Joy Division in on the Neurosis episode, and here we finally get Sisters of Mercy. So, you know, tell us a little bit about, I guess, like for you, what has always been kind of appealing about Sisters of Mercy. I know, you know, Alex is going to talk about why this song in particular, Kiss the Carpet, but
I mean, for me, they're in my, you know, upbringing, they're kind of like the ultimate, you know, goth band to me, gothic rock band. Just because they've got the, you know, Birthday Party, Nick Cave was doing similar vocals. Bauhaus, Peter Murphy was doing similar type of vocals, but nobody quite did it the same as, Jesus, I'm fucking spacing on his name now.
Jesus. I didn't write it down. I figured you might have it.
Usually that's like an instant.
Andy. It's Andy's.
Andrew Eldritch.
Andrew. Yeah, that's, yep.
But that weird kind of like staccato thing that was happening. And even like early, what's his face? Brian Ferry and like Roxy Music.
Yeah, Roxy Music
was doing like similar stuff to that. But this was so stripped down, so like, you know, basic guitar, basic bass, electronic drums. It sounded almost like otherworldly to me. Mm-hmm. And it was the first thing that really kind of hit me as being so fucking out there as far as this music was concerned. It made me feel more akin to a lot of the more, you know, extreme stuff, because that's where I first really heard about it, outside of just, you know, friends like playing it. You know, you heard Vision Thing or something. I think I saw a video for that done 120 minutes or something.
Got it.
But hearing some of the other, you know, like Floodland and stuff, I was like, oh my God, that's insane. Hearing Walk Away, I was like, okay, this is it as far as that's concerned. Like, I don't think you can get any better than that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you kind of throw them in the same category as like Robert Smith with The Cure, and
yeah, he's like on the other end of it. Like the as far as the goth pantheon's concerned, it's very specific for me. But
sure. And I'm probably more of a Joy Division fan than maybe Sisters, but that's because I didn't discover Sisters at the same time you did. Yeah. Like I found them years and years later. Whereas Joy Division, I guess I kind of found like way before. But but like I appreciate Sisters a lot, especially. I actually kind of can't wait to do like a deeper dive into some of that stuff. But it's interesting you brought up Roxy, because I was just having this kind of thought about how important David Bowie and Roxy Music was to like all of this post-punk stuff. Like in a lot of ways,
and Iggy Pop,
in Iggy and in Velvet. And I think you like throw all those, that's it. And I think that's why, you know, people have such reverence for like Velvet Underground in terms of like, you know, the old adage that they didn't sell that many records, but everybody started a band, and there's truth to it.
No, everybody that bought the record started
bought the record. Yeah, exactly. And you could kind of say the same thing about like those first few, like, you know, Sex Pistols shows that like everybody in the crowd like went and fucking formed a band. You know, Susie Sue was there, and, you know, all those kind of guys, you know, Ian Curtis and the Joy Division guys were in the crowd at those first Sex Pistols gigs. And it's kind of the same type of thing, you know? And so, you know, it's hard because I think when you're like a young person and you hear the hype surrounding bands like a Sex Pistols or Velvet Underground, and then you put those records on, like, you're like, oh, these are fine, but they don't sound revolutionary to your ears because you can't hear the historical context in the songs.
And plus some of it seems cliche because you've heard so much of it before.
It is the cliche. Yeah. That's where it sort of came from, you know? And that's kind of like that conversation I was having about Celtic Frost. I'm like, this is the cliche. Like, this is it. You know, when you hear Florida death metal and you hear Obituary and you hear this and you hear Napalm Death they're doing Celtic Frost. It's like, oh, okay. You know, like it lends a sense of appreciation. But yeah, so the Joy Division song that he kind of refers to as She's Lost Control, which is one of my favorites, and then Kiss the Carpet that we're going to hear from Sisters of Mercy from the Reptile House EP from '83. And, you know, both songs he'll kind of reference being influential for the title track. And Hate Song, which kicks off the whole album. There's actually two versions of Hate Song. There's like the dub version, and then there's this version. But
that was a thing in dub, you know, Gothic in dub.
Yeah, Gothic and dub. Yeah. Well, and you also, this is a time of like Scorn doing kind of dub stuff, right? That was kind of a thing as well. But yeah, Hate Songs is it's very sparse. It's very dark. It's very early Sisters of Mercy.
It's that dirginess to it.
Yep. Yeah. And you can find it on the Reptile House EP, but if that's like hard to find, but you can also find it on the Some Girls Wander by Mistake compilation for people that are kind of wanting.
That's the one that I've got. Yeah.
Is that where? Yeah. Yep. That's probably where you've got it. So, and then we get to Hate Song, which kicks off the whole record. And I love the atmosphere. I love the building swagger to that first kind of chunky kind of payoff riff about 1:15 in. And that payoff riff, it's like, it's me in like this era. It's Melvins, it's Corrosion of Conformity, it's Alice in Chains, it's a little bit of Husker Du. It's like all the stuff that like was my gateway towards before I met you and Chris. It was all that kind of hard alternative, alt metal, whatever you want to call that thing that was happening in the early 90s. Helmet was part of that. Prong was part of that. You know, even though Prong came out of thrash circles and Helmet certainly came out of more noise kind of circles, they all sort of started to like gravitate to the center, right? You know, even like Tool is kind of part of that in their early years as well. Like,
I think as far as like mainstream acceptance of heavy music, that was it.
Yeah.
That was the biggest it's ever been. Like, there's no heavy music in mainstream anymore.
No.
Nothing.
I tell people, like, I've played Ministry in my rock class when we had like a little bit of extra time. I'll put on like NWO or even like the title track, Psalm 69. I'll be like, this album sold 1 million copies. And people are like, what? Like 1 million copies of this sold. People were that open. And it's pretty wild. Like I do, in a weird way, in a mainstream way, I do compare the early 90s to the late 60s. And I only in that stuff that was pretty out there was actually kind of accepted. And it was a brief window, and then it kind of all got corporatized, and you know, corporations figure out how to make, facsimiles of Alice in Chains with Creed, and, you know, boy bands and girl bands came back in the late 90s. And, but it was like,
what we're dealing with movies now too, is just exactly facsimiles of things you thought you knew.
That's it. Yeah. It's echoes of echoes, or whatever. Yeah. But it was a moment. It was cool. And it was a great time to be fucking 13 and 14-year-old. You know what I mean? Like, I get why people who grew up as teenagers in the late 60s feel this nostalgia to it, because it would be a cool fucking crazy time to be like a mainstream teenager or a young college kid, So And I was peak MTV. Like I was just like taking it all in and just trying to process it all. And so, with that, whatever, eccentric kind of taste I have is probably formed in that kind of period. Do you remember a band? They were on, I can't remember if they were on Columbia or not, but we talked about them when we did the show on the 90s soundtracks, because they have a song on Nativity in Black. They were called Godspeed. They were the ones that did the song with Bruce Dickinson on Nativity in Black.
Did they actually have like a hit song or a single?
Yeah, they did. It was a song called Ride that was on Headbangers quite a bit. And I had the record at one point. Their entire career is based off of this song, Hate Song. Like you go and listen to, if you like, it's kind of, I'm not saying like spend a lot of time with it, but go on Spotify and just like, type in Godspeed You Black Emperor will of course come first, and you can scroll past it.
Thankfully.
And then you find this Godspeed and just listen to the song Ride. You're like, oh, it's fucking this Fudge Tunnel,
Yeah.
And I always love the riffs on that Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath cover that Dickinson does on Nativity in Black. It's super fucking chunky, and that's Godspeed. And I think they did something weird with the tuning of the bass. I remember like hearing about that. Maybe it was in like Metal Maniacs did like an article on them or whatever. But anyways,
sure they did. Yeah.
There's my obscure early 90s metal band for you Godspeed. So we go from this title track into the aforementioned, we brought them up earlier, Jesus and Mary Chain, and Never Understand from the Psychocandy, which is kind of their masterpiece record. And speaking of NME magazine, this song was the single of the year in 1985. So pretty cool.
Wow.
Piercing noise. That's the thing about Jesus and Mary Chain, but yet like poppy melodies.
Yeah. I got noise / pop sensibilities.
I kind of wrote, the thing for me has always been with Jesus and Mary Chain, especially this song, Never Understand, is it sounds like Beach Boys being tortured by Velvet Underground. Like it has like the same kind of like fun, upbeat kind of like early 60s sort of Beach Boy, but it's like bathed in like, lots of like torturous, piercing sounds. And I think what's interesting about like Jesus and Mary Chain are kind of like on the edge where like sometimes the treble and the like high piercing stuff is almost like pushing into your skull like a little too much, but then they always just back away.
Yeah.
It's weird. You're like right on that age, that razor's edge. And, not only were they a huge influence on like Fudge Tunnel, but we were talking about My Bloody Valentine earlier. That's a band that just bathes in Jesus and Mary Chain,
Yeah, for sure.
And lots of people there. This is the band, like I said, one of the girls I dated in high school put on a mixtape for me and was like, oh, fucking love these guys.
A band that, obviously wasn't an influence to Fudge Tunnel, but I see a lot of, especially going through the entire career, a lot of kind of
people name dropping.
No, not name dropping, but just similar vibes is I Hate God.
Oh yeah. Just, you mean like in terms of
like just like sonicness,
piercing? Yeah.
Like their, feedback, the screaming, but I Hate God's a very American band, but like the same kind of, I think they might pull a lot of the same kind of, influences.
Yeah. That is interesting. They almost, and it's kind of that
guitar
whole
tone too, like that Melvins-ish guitar tone, I think really influenced more people than we could ever imagine.
And I kind of have this feeling that like it's people that kind of came out of the pool of Black Flag and the Melvins, but then like just added like other things, these guys added like a lot more post-punk, whereas I Hate God added like Leonard Skinner to that mix, and it's like, okay, that's where the formula gets like really fucking weird, but yeah.
I Hate God feels as like Ministry feels drug addled. I think I Hate God does as well.
Yes.
There's not a whole lot of bands that feel like they're so like they're there with what they're talking about. Like, okay, this is not, this isn't like they're not putting on airs. This is actually these guys just like documenting their lives.
Well, and we got way into that with our two-parter on that band where like hearing their first record and hearing songs like Depress, I had, like those songs scared me they scared me a lot more than death metal because it was, it seemed like depression was real, like suicide, like all of what and the imagery was just like it made me uncomfortable. Like it was like a David Lynchian kind of uncomfort, you know?
Yeah, when we saw those covers as, when we're younger, we're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Like Take His Need for Pain. Like Jesus
Yeah.
Christ.
Yeah.
Like this was real extreme metal. It wasn't, there's no fantasy about any of this stuff.
Well, I think and we so often, Mark and I being the film guys, and hopefully people who aren't film people appreciate this kind of comparison. It's a difference between like, do you find Friday the 13th scary or do you find David Lynch scary? And for me, like David Lynch is scary. Friday the 13th is Halloween. And
yeah, it's just having fun. It's like you're watching a fake car accident that's over the top. It's not like real psychology. That's the scary shit.
And that's what like most death metal is to me. And there's nothing wrong with it. Death metal is very fun for me. I don't take it like that seriously. And you shouldn't, I hope.
I mean, all the gore stuff, everybody's just taking the piss out of stuff. Nobody's really trying to.
Yeah.
I don't know if Mortician has a sense of humor about their stuff. I've never really read an interview with them, but I hope they do.
I would imagine, But then you get like stuff like Funeral Mist or something like really like visceral sort of black metal, and it's coming from like a more serious, disturbing place, and that stuff's like more unsettling, or like
I was actually going to
stuff that we
bring
talked
that
about,
up with as far as Funeral Mist is concerned, with like in Ministry using samples, and like how much that furthers the whole experience and makes it more real. And kind of puts you in that mindset.
For sure.
I wanted to bring up something. This is not really too. It's about Fudge Tunnel, but on their Wikipedia entry, look up Fudge Tunnel. It says, for the part of the anatomy, in quotes, Fudge Tunnel is slang for C rectum.
Oh, good to know.
Anything.
Good to know.
Fudge Tunnel were an English band from Nottingham.
Yeah, that's funny. So speaking of the Melvins, Alex is going to talk a little bit about the Melvins and Devo and sort of the influence that they had on, in particular, this tune, Bed Crumbs. Jesus, I want to say bread. But yeah, Bed Crumbs from Hate Songs, and also Fugazi too. So Bed Crumbs is like one that is using a lot of that post-punk kind of bass, especially.
Yeah.
David really shines on this song, because he's kind of taking a more tightly wound kind of bass sort of driven kind of sound and running with this one a bit. To me, this one like really bridges those kind of post-punk hardcore influences with the sort of like Rep kind of early Helmet kind of sound. Yeah. You can kind of hear it in
Smashing
like
Pumpkins riffs too.
Yeah, absolutely. Who knew we'd be like, name dropping Smashing Pumpkins and all this. It's kind of fun. It's like a weird, it's weird.
That first Smashing Pumpkins record I fucking love that record.
I actually think Siamese Dream holds up pretty well when you go past the singles. It's
even the singles are great.
Heavy.
You just heard them a million times.
Yeah, exactly. I will say I got a little nostalgic in Yellow Jackets when they're driving around as high schoolers and Today comes on. I was like, all right, that was me. We were all fucking doing that shit in 95, 96, that kind of thing. So, but yeah, so let's get into it. We've got Kiss the Carpet from Sisters of Mercy after we hear a couple of audio clips from Alex here. And then we've got Hate Song, which kicks off Hate Songs in E minor, then Never Understand from the Jesus and Mary chain, and then Bed Crumbs from Fudge Tunnel.
This was the first Joy Division song I ever heard. I was probably 14 or 15, and I couldn't understand what was going on with the drum sound and why was he playing the bass line so high up like that. And then the vocals came in and it all sort of made sense. Like it all came together. Just really, really unique band. And I know I've watched interviews with Hooky where he was like, I started playing the bass line that high because I just had this little amp and I couldn't hear myself. So if I played higher, it was like easier to hear what I was doing. And, and then he figured he'd change it later. And then somebody, probably Ian, was like, no, that's great, keep it. Absolute genius. If you listen to the start of Hate Song, the first song on the Fudge Tunnel record, the bass is quite similar to She's Lost Control, just quite a lot slower. Definitely big influence from this song. I was definitely very goth growing up, and if you're going to do goth, you might as well go to the top and do the Sisters of Mercy. So, I had numerous bands before Fudge Tunnel. One was called Black October, and very Sisters of Mercy style. We had a drum machine. I'm not quite sure about Adrian, like in Sisters of Mercy, but definitely David and myself were big fans. I don't know, Adrian, have you come round to them yet? Probably not. Obviously, the bass tone, I think, is pretty huge influence on Hate Songs. The first song on this record, which is originally from the Reptile House EP, this was a huge influence because of this intro. It starts off with just virtually nothing, just this little echoey beat that's slowly, gradually builds up and up and up. That bass finally comes in, which is this really distorted, cool bass. And then one of the guitars comes in, and then the second guitar comes in, and then everything comes in, and the vocals come in. And it's just amazing how it just builds up and builds up and builds up. It's fantastic. So when we did Hate Songs, the first song on their record, Hate Song, definitely sort of has that vibe where it's, building up into a huge riff. And this Sisters of Mercy song was definitely a big influence on that. But also on pretty much everything, I think. suppose the Jesus and Mary Chain influence is pretty clear. There's the buried reverb vocals, the fuzz feedback guitar. It's all over Hate songs, and I loved Psychocandy growing up, so that was a huge influence on me. I played Psychocandy so much that, you know, I'd have like my mom would be coming up the stairs and going, "Alex, you've left the vacuum cleaner on again, and why are you cleaning your room so much?" And I'd have to tell her, like, "No, Mom, this is a band. This is a Jesus and Mary Chain," and she'd just be like, "Ugh." Teenage Fan Club was another band.
The sun comes up another day begins, and I don't even worry about the state I'm in. And so early and I'm looking good, but when the sun goes down, I'm gonna start again. Never understand me. You never understand me, yeah. Start to run and take a look at me. Well, don't you take closely? Tell me what you see. Things you say are only disagree. You never understand. That's what I wanna be. Never understand. You never understand me, yeah. Listen to heart, but you just can't see me. You tell you the truth, but you don't believe me. Thinking out loud, I can hear what you're saying. Tomorrow I'm leaving, 'cause I'm not staying, yeah. 'Cause I'm not staying, yeah. 'Cause I'm not staying, yeah. 'Cause I'm not staying.
Well, no mistaking the fact that Melvins were definitely a big influence for us. I think for me it's sort of the idea that they were like a metal band, but they were just way, way, way too weird to be remotely metal. And I think that's sort of how Fudge Tunnel saw ourselves as well. But, you know, like on this song, it starts and all of a sudden out of nowhere, everything drops out and it's just this weird drum beat with these tortured vocals. Who even knows what he's talking about? It's just brilliant. I think hearing Melvins sort of taught us to slow down a bit and start playing this sort of heavier, sludgier sort of stuff. We all sort of came from a bit of a goth and punk background, and so like mid-tempo or fast was usually the thing, but hearing Melvins, it was just so powerful to leave that amount of space in everything and, you know, and have these sort of weird, aggressive, angular riffs. A brilliant band. And of course, years later, I was fortunate enough to work with them on the Stag record, which was a lot of fun. Those guys are really creative and fun band. If you listen to this song and then check out Crumbs, the second song on Hate Songs, you'll hear a very similar guitar part. It's a diminished fifth, and then you resolve it, and then you go diminished fifth again. It's one of the most ugly, evil sounding things you can do with a guitar, and it's brilliant. Thanks, Buzz. I loved Devo growing up, and Whip It was definitely a big influence, the guitar riff. But I think, in particular, on this song, it's that sort of stop, start guitar thing that I really love. And you can hear that influence pretty clearly on Breadcrumbs, the second track on Hate Songs, where it's stop, start. It's kind of the same thing. Definitely huge fans of Fugazi, and we were very fortunate to be able to tour with them, I think 89 or 90 in Europe. And you know, the whole band obviously was incredible, but the rhythm section in particular was a very huge influence for Hate Songs. You can hear that on the intro of Boston Baby, a sort of classic Fugazi rhythm section. The middle section in Gut Rut, classic Fugazi, sort of funky bass and drums. Soap and Water, the intro is Fugazi, and that sort of whole middle section of Tweezers too. So they were really incredible, both on record and live. Huge influence. In fact, I went out and bought my Gibson SG after seeing Fugazi and my Marshall JMP because I wanted to just sound exactly like them. They were such an incredible band to play with. They were so gracious and fantastic to us, and never forget that. Probably quite a large influence on the vocals too. Definitely the sort of shouty Ian Mackay thing was a big influence.
That was Breadcrumbs from Fudge Tunnel, Never Understand from the Jesus and Mary Chain, Hate Song from Fudge Tunnel, and we kicked off with Kiss the Carpet. And Alex kind of chatting a little bit about the influence Fugazi had on that last tune, Breadcrumbs there. And we'll hear from him one more time in part one. He's going to talk a little bit about the influence that Killing Joke has, and that's another band that's, I think, near and dear to us, especially Chris. Really kind of made me appreciate how Killing Joke in a big way. But
I really love that first record a lot. I don't know as much about the rest, but that first one's
Yeah,
incredible.
all of it's they're like, that's a band like we could do a real episode on because they're just fucking phenomenal. You know, there's probably a couple like lower points, but yeah, they're kind of consistently interesting on almost everything.
They're like on the Voivod level as far as going all over the place and still like being interesting at all times.
I think that's a really good comparison. Absolutely. So I thought this would be a good time to read Nick's intro to the piece because I didn't want to read it until we were kind of fully enveloped in Hate Songs, but we're going to kind of wrap up Hate Songs here at the end of part 1 of Fudge Tunnel. And Nick, in his intro to the Decibel Hall of Fame piece, says that Fudge Tunnel's first movement celebrates its 30th, now 31st anniversary this year, but the paint still feels very fresh. The Nottingham Trio's brand of noise rock, plenty of distortion, molten tempos, and ritual abuse of instruments, has been oft imitated but never truly replicated since the release of Hate Songs in E minor. The band's contemporaries aim to add rhythmic complexity to the canvas of noise. Kindred spirits like the Jesus Lizard and Helmet probably had a longer shelf life simply because they were digestible. Whether it was an act of self-sabotage or unrecognized genius, Fudge Tunnel were committed to making music that was often unflinchingly, ruthlessly ugly. Of course, guitarist vocalist Alex Newport, drummer Adrian Parkin, and bassist David Riley were also the ultimate ironists. This becomes indelible in the album's liner notes, where the trio mocked the Rolling Stones by dubbing themselves the Sphincter Triplets, invited fans to bribe them with cash and peanut M&Ms, and skewered the early 90s trends of impossibly long thankless with this blunt invocation. If you expected a mention and didn't get one, don't worry. We probably don't like you. The band's warped sense of humor is also reflected in its choice of cover material. Their chopped and screwed version of Sunshine of Your Love, the intended album closer, simultaneously desecrates the original and states the case for Fudge Tunnel's arrival as a power trio in the mold of Cream. The great leap forward between Fudge Tunnel's early EPs and Hate Songs owes a lot to the experience of working in a proper studio with high-quality equipment and veteran personnel. According to the band producer Colin Richardson, who had worked on soon-to-be classics from Bolt Thrower and Carcass, was essential in helping Fudge Tunnel achieve the sound they'd all heard in their heads. Growing comfort in the studio also allowed for continued experimentation with Einstürzende Neubauten-esque mechanical noise from power tools and pickups, audible at the beginning of the Hate Song version, which is, I think, the second version we didn't play, and the tail end of Sunshine of Your Love, and everywhere in between. Tracks like album opener Hate Song and Tweezers certainly offer echoes of what was going on across the pond in the burgeoning American grunge scene. Fudge Tunnel enjoyed This Is Spinal Tap and Drop D tuning as much as anyone else. But Hate Songs is not grunge. It's not hardcore either, despite what Soap and Water might suggest. And it ain't quite metal, a label the band rejected from the start. So here's the story of the Hate Songs in E minor, an album that embodies both sides of Black Flag's My War on every single song. A remarkable study in contradictions.
It's a good intro.
Yeah, I think Nick nails it with it's both sides of My War from Black Flag, at all times. And so I think, that's kind of one thing to kind of think about. And Nick kind of brought up the sort of grunge comparisons, and it really started with all of the marketing campaign that was sort of used and centered around Hate Songs. And I think it's important to realize that 91 is also the year that sort of Nirvana broke too. Nevermind comes out, I think, in September of 91.
Well, this comes out 6 months after.
This comes out 6 months after Nevermind.
I think so. Or there are maybe before. I don't. They come out so quickly, near each other that there was obviously no.
Sure.
They weren't influences on each other.
Although in part 2, Alex will talk about being a big fan of Bleach and stuff. So, but okay. Nevermind is its own weird thing, But
Nevermind is like Bleach is so different than Nevermind.
Yeah. Bleach is a sub pop record. Nevermind is a Geffen record.
But even just sound, like sonically, it's so different. But
yeah, absolutely. But they kind of talk a little bit about it. Nick asks him, he says, how was the album received when it was released in August of 91? Did other goings on in alternative music during the year punk broke lead to increased attention or scrutiny? And Adrian says, it was pretty well received. Kerrang and Sounds loved it. We never got any other press in NME or Melody Maker. Magazines like Metal Hammer were perplexed because Fudge Tunnel was heavy, but not heavy metal. They didn't know how to deal with it. Hate Songs was a bit of a slow burner, to be honest. It was well received. It was well received critically, but we didn't have a lot of fans at the time. We weren't immediately playing to thousands of people when the record came out. There wasn't a big campaign accompanying it. It was just another album on Earache. I don't recall us being particularly disappointed because we were just so chuffed to have a great sounding album come out. And then David Riley says, well, it got good reviews, but we'd always had good reviews up until then. It was only once the whole grunge thing blew up that journalists, hang on, I got flip pages here, went against us. Journos are always looking to hype the new thing. And once something has gone mainstream, it's not cool anymore. And of course, Earache started presenting us to press in the context of grunge, hoping to sell a few extra records. We didn't feel part of that any more than we felt part of the grindcore scene. But yes, we probably got a bit of attention from it. And then Alex kind of finishes the thoughts here. He says, at some point, marketing for Hate Songs switched to draw parallels with Nirvana. There was actually an ad in Rolling Stone that said the UK's answer to Nirvana. We were so livid when we saw that. It was helpful for the label, but not for the band. Later, we'd play on the West Coast in the States, and people would be like, you're British? I thought you were from Seattle. That plays into our relationship with Earache, which was tumultuous. At one point, I joked to Digby that the only reason he signed Fudge Tunnel was because we kind of sounded like Nirvana, and he thought he could make a bunch of money from it. And he said, well, yeah. Being compared to Nirvana is not necessarily a bad thing. My fear was always wondering what would happen if someone who liked Nirvana bought our record and ended up really disappointed. That kind of direct comparison can be really detrimental to a band. And so,
I never even that wasn't even a comparison to me.
Yeah, it is
like maybe so obvious that I missed it.
Yeah,
but
you never really were as big into that. I think you were more into Soundgarden and a few other bands. I think
I like Soundgarden, Alice in Chains way more than Nirvana for sure.
And so like we were really into Bleach in a big way, and we were always trying to point out to people like how there were songs on Bleach that sounded like Slayer and other things, and it was almost like a badge of honor. Like we loved Nirvana, Nevermind, when it came out, but then we wanted to almost like call out the people that just bought it because it was popular and be like, have you listened to Bleach? And we would like shove that at people and be like, you know where they're coming from, that they like, only wanted Andy Wallace to like do Nevermind because they love fucking Seasons of the Abyss. And people are like, what? This is, so we were always, we were like trolling people, as you do as a fucking teenager or whatever. So, I would always fly the flag that Nirvana was like way hipper and way more cool than people I think gave it credit for. And I think they got a lot of unnecessary hate because of just how many records they fucking sold, which isn't necessarily their fault, Well,
I mean, we hated them because we didn't give a shit about anything that was popular because we were listening to stuff that nobody gave a shit about.
Exactly. Yeah, it was anathema to become popular, which Alex just kind of said there, that like the second you like get popular, like the second like your street cred goes away. And I think sadly, that thought is probably what like contribute to like fucking Kurt Cobain's suicide, because he's like a guy that wanted to be like us. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I mean, I remember when me and Chris were doing the Furnace, which was WMHW, the college radio station for Central Michigan University.
Yeah. Yep.
In the summer, and we were almost like we were offering out prizes based on him dying.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Like we were completely fucking thoughtless about any of that stuff.
Yeah,
and we didn't have FCC licenses either, and we were offering this stuff, so it was kind of funny. And
I think like I don't know. I think I get it because when you're young, you're naive, and I said a lot of really dumb things about things I didn't understand sometimes, or I hadn't.
Well, we were just being like thoughtless. It was just like somebody just fucking killed themselves. Like it's not something to make fun of. And
you don't like understand like what was sort of like going on for him, like I know
unless you're a politician, you can't make fun of people killing themselves.
Yeah, exactly. But I know like Henry Rollins sort of talks in one of the documentaries I show in class that like, he would try to go to like the same thrift shops that he like always went to, and like he couldn't get in because like people were like busting through the like glass trying to like get in after him and stuff. And at a certain point, it just, you know, sensitive people just don't make it in rock and roll. And, you know, that happened to Hendrix, that happened to, you know, people that just can't survive. They're almost like too
27 Club,
emotionally.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the 27 Club were like too emotionally raw, and like that fucking shit just like you can't survive. You can't be that kind of person and survive unless you stay like in an underground band. You know?
I mean, I couldn't imagine, you know, I would throw myself into the sensitive artist type, and, you know, I make fun of people with feelings because I have feelings. But at that age, I could not imagine handling that level of success that they got.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like from everybody else in that scene, nobody, like, it was just insane. It was like Beatles level. It was insane.
It was really, really insane. And, you know, the reason the Beatles survived it, from everything I've sort of studied, is because they were a unit, and they like all had each other's backs. And when like people would come at them, they like supported each other. And I'm not saying Nirvana didn't, but Nirvana was like way more fucked up with like Kurt's like drug abuse. And it was just, they didn't have
probably
like
depression or something, you know, like everybody was dealing with something then.
Yep. And they just, you know, you have to have like your ducks in order if you're going to go through that. And very few people can kind of do it. And, you know, you think of like sensitive people like your Elliott Smiths or Nick Drakes or whatever, like there was no way for those people to like make it that far, you know, before.
No, there's no way.
It was just time. And that's very sad, you know, but
I mean, that kind of industry, the industry in general, the industry of anybody trying to make art into commerce is like a fucking meat grinder.
Yep.
And if you're successful, it's even worse because it's just, you know, there's even more demands put upon you.
And I think that's maybe a shift that happened from like the era of like the Beatles and Bob Dylan in the 60s, where like art wasn't measured necessarily by commerce.
Yeah. Well, you could, if you got a record deal, you could have, you know, 2 or 3 records to try to like shape yourself to figure out what you're going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And anymore, there's none of that anymore.
Yep. Yeah, you can. And certainly those bands that peaked in the 60s like had a lot of room to do a lot of experimentation. And like, you know, it's kind of shocking to like, you know, play stuff from, you know, the White Album to kids and be like, this is the biggest band in the world, and they're doing like this song about shooting heroin called Happiness is a Warm Gun. And kids are just like, whoa, that's pretty fucking wild. I'm like, yeah, it is wild, because like they could do anything they wanted and people just bought it. And that's pretty fucking rare. And
they had artistic control.
Yeah. Yeah. And whether you
like
hate the Beatles or don't, you have to respect the fact that they were like, hey, kids, like get into like Eastern philosophy, because we're going to fucking play a raga, you know, like, okay. You know, like that opened up a lot of kids to like kind of challenge things that you know, Western religion and all that shit's cool, because it like, it did change a lot of things, whether you appreciate the music or not, like the artistry and like, you know, Velvet Underground and those kind of bands, like just really like fucking shit up and really trying to, I don't know. And that still exists. It just doesn't exist on a mainstream level anymore. He's gotta.
No. And a lot of it is derivative. There's only so far like rock and roll music can go.
Yeah.
In general, like there's only so far you can really push it. Like, I don't know what you can push anymore to really make anything like that crazy and extreme. It's just like incrementally different.
I think it's why, in a mainstream way, I think it's why like hip hop took that mantle, and like the really like interesting mainstream things sometimes come out of hip hop. Not all the time. There's a lot of like bad mainstream hip hop, but
I think that's the last that's the last
Yeah.
genre that I think that's really kept it up for a while.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't like, you know, I can't think of the last metal band that's really pushed the envelope to really, you know, the next level of extremity.
Yeah. It's kind of really become classic rock, you know, and here we are as two.
Yeah. I mean, Obituary is basically like, you know, fucking John Fogerty records.
Yeah.
At this point.
Yeah, it's like, you know, we're two 40-somethings, you know, like
some camo shorts. I'll be 50 in 3 years. Like,
yeah,
I'm not that extreme.
No,
but also like real extreme shit now is like so overly complicated that it lacks it doesn't resonate with me at all.
And I think maybe the extremities are not going to be found in metal as much. It might be like in electronic music or, you know, some of those kind of areas where people might be pushing things. And I don't know about that, but I know that it's big, and it's speaking to younger people in a way that like metal spoke to us 25 years ago or something. You know, I don't know. So
I don't know. It's a weird, like there's so much stuff. Like when you have access to everything, what's good?
My kids asked me the other day when we were talking about, you know, Bob Dylan, and we were talking about like Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, and they're like, they actually asked, they go, what do you think is like this today? And I was like, I'll be honest, like I'm throwing the question back at you, because like you guys have a better sense of that pulse. And they kind of said, they're like, oh, well, you know, the hip hop, you know, they said Kendrick, they said Mac Miller, who just passed away, Tyler, the Creator, that there are people that are really, you know, they're kind of doing what like Radiohead was doing in the 90s, but they're doing it with like hip hop, you know, which is cool, you know, like that's
but it's
great.
Still very incrementally changing things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like I don't really know what else is out there.
No,
for that type of, like we've kind of pushed it. You know, it went from from punk to hardcore to metal, death metal, all that. Like, what else is really the next? I don't know what the next level of that is.
And maybe it jumps out of music too. Maybe it goes to a different medium, like, you know, video games, or it just goes to like a different artistic expression that just needs to like run with that torch, you know?
Yeah.
Like think of like how television in a lot of ways the last like 15 years has been more interesting than like mainstream film. You know, it's like
almost last 20. Yeah.
Whereas like television when we were growing up was very much like safe and you know, it was fine, but like sitcoms were pretty predictable and
it was serialized entertainment.
Yeah. But then but things kind of like when blockbuster kind of movies sort of start to take over in the late 2000s or early 2000s or whatever, it's like television starts to like go through its golden age, you know, with HBO and stuff like that, where artists have a like better playground. And maybe like music is no longer that place for artistic exploration, and us being older, who the fuck knows? Maybe it's like fucking TikTok, and maybe like there's crazy shit happening in like these weird fucking memes and things that like are beyond, I don't know, my understanding. But
I don't think they're beyond our understanding, but I think they're beyond what we consider art.
Yeah, it's not
like somebody coming up with like, you know, a 30-second video of them doing some random thing that becomes like a huge deal, like that people are, you know, can live off of TikTok videos.
Yeah,
I don't see the longevity of that. Like music in general, like that can go through so many different permutations, but like something that's like a 30-second snippet, there's only so much of that you can really capture before it's done. It's like a finite kind of thing, I think.
Sure.
I can't imagine then there's like, you know, you turn it like there's like every, like I don't know if you've watched the latest season of Better Call Saul. Or the
haven't yet. It's on my DVR. So yeah,
it's so refreshing to see something that where you watch somebody just going through motions in an artistic way, doing some, you know, whatever the process might be, that they're doing something that's, you know, leads to something else in the story, and there's no exposition. You know, there might be some music over the top of it or something like that, but like where it's purely about the story and there's no other reason why. It's not about pushing anything. It's not about trying to say anything about anything. It's about trying to make this story that they're telling be the most succinct, artistic version of that expression as they can.
Yeah.
That's the stuff that's becoming more rare to me, because there's so many, there's thousands of TV shows out there right now.
Yeah.
I don't give a shit about 99% of them.
Yeah.
There's literally nothing I give a shit about, you know, outside and the television shows are concerned. Like the last Batman movie I tried to watch, and I was like, oh my, I just hated it. I hated everything about it. It was so fucking boring to me, but people liked it a lot. And I was like,
yeah, I liked it in the theater.
It was just not, there's nothing there for me. I don't know. But then I loved The Northman. So
yeah, sure.
I don't know.
I mean, I think we might be getting to like that era where like Mike, our old manager's at, probably with like jazz, where like jazz is like this thing that's still around, but it's like on the fringes and it's not really something a lot of people talk about. I mean, metal's like has like its tribal sort of thing, and I'm sure jazz does too in its own weird circles, but yeah, it might be just kind of a thing where like the older we get, the more, we're still talking about John Coltrane records. Like John Coltrane is like the early 90s and 80s metal and, stuff like that almost.
Well, today on NPR, I was listening they were talking about some fucking German, what the hell is this? It was a jazz kind of improv group that's been around for the last 35 years or something that all just plays, what is it? Bass, like, the Woody Allen instrument that's in all the early Woody Allen movies.
Oh, shit. Clarinets.
Yeah, it's like a clarinet trio. And I was like, this is the most boring, old... like, why are you even talking about this on... Like, there's nothing innovative about this whatsoever, but I don't know. I'm not a tastemaker.
People like, Wynton Marsalis or whatever.
Oh, Jesus.
like there's...
Hey, man, you like white bread? Here's some real white bread.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's, it's kind of interesting. And speaking of kind of bringing it back to kind of where we sort of launched off into this, like we talked about Nirvana a little bit, but around this time they actually did tour with Jesus Lizard, Fugazi, and No Means No, and they were actually supposed to open for Nirvana and Bikini Kill in Japan, but they actually pulled out. Well,
they pulled out, but then they were going to do the Nirvana show in the States. But I think Cobain got sick or something.
Yeah, that ended up not happening too. So. And we'll, as we sort of go out here, I wanted to share one kind of last thought from Nick's interview, and it's kind of Alex's final words in the whole thing. And, they're kind of talking about the legacy of hate songs a bit. And Alex says, most of the time when I listen to stuff that people send me that they say was influenced by Fudge Tunnel, I'll hear it and think, okay, you've completely missed the point. A lot of his doomy or sludgy music with lyrics pulled out of Dungeons and Dragons. They'll capture the heaviness of Fudge Tunnel, but completely miss out on the ironic humor or the noisy industrial arty elements that we are trying to incorporate. It's interesting to me that you could listen to Fudge Tunnel and just come out sounding like a sludge band. That's really not what we were about at all. A problem for me is that I don't listen to that kind of music, and I don't even, I didn't even when I was in Fudge Tunnel. Hate Songs in E minor is a misunderstood album, but the entire career of Fudge Tunnel is completely misunderstood. And I think that's kind of a good way to kind of, close this sort of, I guess, part one in a certain sense. And so the last song we will hear is from Hate Songs is Gut Rot. And I just said, this is like a classic song where like, it's pretty much just a Fudge Tunnel song. It's good, but there's not like a lot that I would say that's like differentiates it other than it's got some kind of thrashy elements, kind of like what we heard earlier in a couple, Fudge Tunnel tunes.
Yeah, there's the bass break which happens in a lot of songs where there's just the bass and the drums going, and then Alex is kind of just doing feedback over the top of everything.
Yeah, it's that great kind of final riff burst at the end that's pretty fun. It's kind of a fun little thing. So, but we're going to be doing this as kind of a 2-part, and I've got some like letters and feedback, but I'll read those in part 2 because I have a feeling we'll have a little bit more time. But I guess as we sort of close out part 1, I did want to sort of at least acknowledge that we have 2 new patrons, Christian Grillet and Matthew Holland. So thank you for becoming patrons. We do really appreciate that. And if you like what we're doing, or you've been thinking about wanting to become a patron, you can go to patreon.com/Requiem podcast, or you can go to requiemmetal.com and click on the Patreon link that's there. That's where you can also find our first 160 episodes. You can also find merch that Mark has designed and illustrated and put up there. You can get grocery bags and t-shirts and other cool things.
Everything a middle-aged person needs.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And if you want to leave us some feedback, we're going to read some letters and some other kind of social media feedback that we got on some of the episodes from patrons and things like that. You can go to requiempodcast@gmail.com. Sorry. You can check us out on Facebook, Jason and Mark, on Instagram, Requiem Metal Podcast, or you can also check us out on Twitter. That's a good place to sort of find us as well. And we love reading sort of comments and things like that. If you want to leave us some ratings on iTunes/Apple Music and or Spotify, we do really appreciate all that. And for people that are maybe hesitant about becoming a patron, like We have some that sign up for $10 a month. We have some that are $5 a month. We have some that are like $2 a month. So, we're not asking for kind of a ton. But
I think it's also, it's cheaper than any of the other, like, HBO Max, and you always get more quality content that you actually want to watch per week.
Yeah.
With our with the Patreon page.
That's it.
Then a lot of these other services, you're going to scroll for hours. For us, you can be like, I don't know about Fudge Tunnel. I'll listen to it for a minute, see what I think. Like, oh, this is okay. Cool.
You get some in-depth analysis and kind of have some fun. And also,
you can wash your dishes at the same time.
There you go. Yeah. Put on your headphones and do some yard work. I mowed the lawn to some Requiem podcast the other day. But yeah, like, we did record a Patreon episode. I did let the patrons know. We're just kind of waiting on an interview to sort of link into it. So there should be a kind of a patron only episode. We actually did drop episode into the mainstream public, probably just as you guys are, as we're recording this, the Fu Manchu episode. So if you check out that Fu Manchu episode and you kind of dig the kind of like laid back, more kind of fun, sort of little looser kind of vibes that we sort of bring to the patron shows, then that's the kind of stuff you're going to get. And the patrons have had that show for almost a year, because we did that last summer. So so that's the kind of stuff that we're kind of doing for the patrons. We did a best of 2-parter, and now we have our own patron stream, so you can have an exclusive thing that downloads into your podcasting feeds and things like that. So so I think that's a good place to sort of end part 1. So we do appreciate, Alex, and once again, the title is where you can find all of those clips, including a bunch that we didn't use. I do highly recommend it, checking it out on the title app and kind of signing up for that and having some fun with it. And then, So anything else to add before we leave Hate Songs behind and then add, part 2 of these guys?
This is our first movement. We'll be back for the number 2.
Absolutely. So we're going to hear from Alex, talk a little bit about Killing Joke, and then we'll hear Gut Rot from Hate Songs in E minor. And so for Requiem Metal Podcast, I am Jason.
And I'm Mark.
Killing Joke also hugely influential for myself as a guitar player, and I think for the whole band. Definitely that super distorted guitar sound is fantastic, but also the sort of hypnotic grooves similar to Loop and Gang of Four too, like Killing Joke just sort of masters at that. But also Jazz did a lot of really cool things with his vocals in the studio, which was very influential. On Gut Rot, the vocal effect was literally we were in the studio doing Hate Songs, and I played Colin this song Butcher and said, I want my vocals to sound like this. Like, what is it like? How does he sing like that? Or how do you do that? And Colin was like, oh yeah, you just distort the hell out of it. And I was like, great, let's do it. So, so you take a channel and just crank it on the desk until it really distorts. I just love that sound. So that was totally from Killing Joke. Tweezers, the vocal effects on Tweezers, also Killing Joke. And Sunshine of Your Love, the distorted vocals and the sort of weird effects, they're all over this record. And then, another record that was absolutely huge for me and my friends growing up was Nighttime, which is an amazing record.